Hello everyone, and welcome back to ET Diaries. Here on this channel, I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I had always gone night fishing on the lake. It's something I've done for as long as I can remember, and there's a peace to it, especially when you're alone on the water under the stars. I was never the kind of person to get spooked easily, but this night, it was different. It was about 2 years ago, early in the summer. I had the whole lake to myself, no other boats out there, just the soft lapping of water against the hull and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. I don't usually stay out this late, but the fishing had been good and I figured I'd push it a little longer before heading back. The moon was full, casting silver streaks across the water, and the air had that crisp coolness that only comes at night by a lake. I had my lantern beside me and a radio playing softly. The only sounds I could hear were the croaking of frogs and the occasional hoot of an owl. Nothing unusual about it. Nothing at all. It was just after midnight when I started to feel a little off. I couldn't explain why. It wasn't the usual quiet calm that I was used to. It was like something was pressing on the edges of my thoughts. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired, but then I heard something that made me freeze. At first, it was just a soft hum, almost like a distant engine or maybe a boat far away, but there was something off about it. It wasn't the usual sound you'd hear on the lake. This wasn't a sound you could place, not one you could even recognize. It didn't seem to be coming from any direction either. It was just there, filling the air, vibrating through the water. I looked around, trying to spot anything unusual. The fog had started to roll in from the shore, creeping in thick tendrils, but there was still enough light from the moon to see the immediate area. Nothing. I figured it was just my imagination and went back to fishing. But the hum wouldn't stop. It got louder, more constant, and that's when I saw them. At first, it was just a couple of faint lights. Small, round, like lanterns, but they were floating on the surface of the water, and there was no way to explain them. They weren't boats or reflections. I thought maybe I was seeing things, or maybe there were some other fishermen out there with strange lights. But no. I stared harder. The lights were hovering just above the water, moving slowly around my boat in a perfect circle. At first, I thought they were fireflies or something similar, but they were too steady, too intentional. They didn't flicker or fly erratically like insects. They moved as though they were being controlled, and the closer I looked, the stranger they seemed. There were 3 of them, then 4, then 5, each one floating in a small arc around me just above the surface. They didn't make a sound, just hovered, their lights glowing a soft blue that cut through the mist. My heart started to race. I tried to tell myself they were just some sort of natural phenomenon, maybe some kind of bioluminescent algae or something, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. These things were too deliberate. I reached for my flashlight, wanting to get a better look, but when I flicked it on, it did nothing. The beam didn't even cut through the fog like it usually did. It was as if the light wasn't allowed to reach them. The orbs just continued floating, moving slowly in their silent, calculated pattern. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and that's when I realized I wasn't alone. They weren't just floating above the water. They were studying it, watching it. The way they moved, the way they rotated around me, it was as if they were mapping something far beyond what I could understand. One of the orbs dipped lower, close enough that I could almost feel the air around it shift. It wasn't close enough to touch, but I felt a strange pressure, like the atmosphere was changing. Then, in an instant, it darted back up into the air, and I swear the air felt thicker. The hum I'd been hearing grew louder again, like something deep beneath the water had just awakened. It wasn't the water itself, but something below it. Something that had been there for longer than I'd realized. I'm not proud of how fast my heart started to pound, but I wasn't about to sit there and wait for whatever these things were to show their full hand. I started pulling in my fishing line, trying to act normal, trying to ignore the fear gnawing at the pit of my stomach. I told myself, just get the gear in, get the boat turned around, and leave. But the orbs were faster than I could react. They moved in closer, surrounding my boat now, and I could see them more clearly. They weren't like any lights I'd seen before. They didn't just glow, they pulsed rhythmically, and as I watched them, the hairs on my neck stood up. They weren't just lights. They were something more, like probes, tiny hovering devices that were more alive than I had ever expected anything from the water to be. It was then that I saw it, just beneath the surface of the water, barely visible under the moon's light. Something massive was moving. I could see the faint outline of a shape, like a shadow deep in the lake, undulating and shifting. The orbs seemed to react to it, as if they were communicating with whatever was down there. They'd dart toward the surface of the water, circle around for a moment, then move back. It was like they were studying the movement, the behavior, and the flow of whatever lay beneath. I didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. Without thinking, I grabbed my paddle and started pushing the boat forward. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with everything I had just seen. The orbs followed, their lights bobbing and shifting as they continued their silent surveillance. It was like they were never going to leave. But then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the orbs started to pull away. One by one, they drifted back into the fog, further and further until they were swallowed up by the mist. The hum started to fade with them, and just like that, the night was quiet again. My boat felt lighter. The weight of their presence lifted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just been set in motion, something bigger than me or anything I could understand. I didn't look back after that. I rowed as fast as I could, heading straight for the shore, the paddles cutting through the water with urgency. When I finally made it back to the dock, I didn't even bother to unload my gear. I just wanted to get off the lake. The next day, I went back to the spot, but there was nothing. No orbs, no strange hum. The water was calm, the air was still. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. Those things, they weren't of this world, and I wasn't supposed to see them. But I did. And now, every time I go back to that lake, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting. I don't fish at night anymore, and I haven't told anyone else what I saw. I don't think they'd believe me. But I know what happened, and I know that something out there in the dark water is being watched. It was studying the lake, and I was just a tiny part of it. It happened a couple of years ago, but I still think about it almost every day. I used to work in Antarctica, part of a research team studying climate patterns. It was mostly routine, collecting ice core samples, measuring atmospheric gases, stuff like that. The kind of work that feels important, even if it's not exciting. But things changed when we stumbled upon something buried deep in the ice, something that didn't belong there. The station was isolated, like all Antarctic stations are. There were 10 of us, stationed there for 6 months. The cold and the silence get to you after a while, but you get used to it. We had a few snowcats, radar equipment, and plenty of tools for digging and drilling. It was on one of our surveys about 20 kilometers from the main station that we first detected something strange. The radar picked up an anomaly under the ice. It wasn't uncommon to find voids or layers of unusual material, but this was different. The shape was too regular, too symmetrical. It was buried deep, about 300 meters down. We marked the location and reported it back to the station, expecting to analyze it later, but curiosity got the better of us. A team of 4, including me, decided to investigate. It took us 2 days to set up the equipment and start drilling. The ice was thick and hard, but we made progress. The deeper we went, the more we realized that this wasn't a natural formation. The radar showed sharp edges, angles that didn't occur in nature. By the 4th day, we broke through into a hollow space. At first, we thought it was a cave. The walls were smooth, almost polished, but they didn't feel like rock or ice. They had a metallic quality, but the material was cold, colder than the surrounding ice. The air inside was thin but breathable. We couldn't explain it. There was no sign of how the space had formed or why it hadn't collapsed under the weight of the ice above it. As we moved deeper, we found what looked like a structure. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a small aircraft hangar, but it was clearly artificial. The walls were covered in strange patterns, lines and symbols that seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. None of us could figure out how it worked. There were no seams, no rivets, no obvious way it had been constructed. At the center of the structure was an object. It was large, about the size of a bus, and shaped like a teardrop. It had the same metallic sheen as the walls, but it seemed alive. Not moving exactly, but there was an energy to it, a hum that you could feel in your bones. We realized it wasn't just an object. It was a vessel. We didn't touch it at first. No one wanted to be the one to break something that had been buried for who knows how long. We took pictures, collected samples of the ice around it, and documented everything. But the more time we spent in the chamber, the more uneasy I felt. The hum wasn't just noise. It was like it was inside my head, resonating in a way I couldn't ignore. The decision to open the vessel wasn't ours. When we reported our findings, the higher-ups at the research organization sent instructions to proceed. They didn't tell us much, just that we needed to take a closer look. A team of engineers arrived within a week, bringing specialized equipment. That's when things started to go wrong. The engineers brought a cutting tool, some kind of high-powered laser, to breach the hull. As soon as they started, the hum intensified. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a vibration that shook the entire chamber. The symbols on the walls began to change, shifting and rearranging themselves like they were reacting to what we were doing. I felt a pressure in my chest, like the air was being sucked out of the room. Then the vessel opened on its own. A seam appeared along its side, and the teardrop shape split apart. Inside there were pods, about a dozen of them, arranged in a circle. Each one was filled with a clear liquid, and suspended inside were beings. They weren't human. They were tall, with elongated limbs and smooth, pale skin. Their eyes were large and dark, and their features were sharp, almost insect-like. They didn't move, but they didn't look dead either. They looked preserved, like they were sleeping. The engineers didn't stop. They started taking samples from the pods, analyzing the liquid, trying to figure out what we were dealing with. But the more they disturbed the vessel, the more the hum grew. It was deafening by the second day, and the air in the chamber became almost unbearable. It felt charged, like a storm was about to break. On the third day, the beings woke up. I was in the main station when it happened. The team at the site radioed in, panicked, saying that the pods had opened and the beings were moving. The signal cut out before they could explain. We tried to reach them, but there was only static. A group of us suited up and drove out to the site, but by the time we got there, the chamber was empty. The vessel was still there, but the pods were open and the beings were gone. The engineers were gone too. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no footprints in the snow outside. Just nothing. We didn't stay long. The hum was still there, louder than ever, and the symbols on the walls were flashing now, cycling through patterns that made my head hurt to look at. We packed up what we could and left. In the weeks that followed, we started seeing things. Strange lights in the sky, shadows moving where there shouldn't have been any. Equipment malfunctioned constantly, and the animals in the area, seals, penguins, disappeared. Some of the team claimed they heard voices, whispers in the wind, but I never did. What I felt was worse, the sensation of being watched all the time, even when I was alone. Eventually, the organization shut the station down. They called it a logistical decision, but we all knew the real reason. Whatever we had uncovered, it wasn't meant to be found. I left Antarctica after that. I couldn't stay. The memories were too fresh, too raw. But even now, halfway across the world, I still feel it sometimes, that hum, faint and distant, like it's waiting. It started on a Tuesday night, like any other shift. I worked as a security guard at a small office complex on the edge of town. It wasn't an exciting job, mostly just walking around the property and keeping an eye on the CCTV cameras. The building itself wasn't big, just 3 floors with a parking lot and a few storage sheds out back. Most nights, nothing happened, and I'd spend the hours flipping through old magazines or staring at the monitors until my eyes burned. That night, though, something changed. Around 2:15 a.m., I was sitting in the control room, sipping stale coffee and watching the cameras. There were 12 screens in total, covering the hallways, the parking lot, and the entrances. One of the feeds, camera 8, showed the rear lot by the sheds. That area was always quiet. Barely anyone used those sheds, and the motion-activated floodlights rarely came on. As I scanned the screens, I noticed something odd on camera 8. At first, I thought it was a glitch. There was this faint shimmer near one of the sheds, like a heat wave or a ripple in water. It moved slowly, almost like it was drifting in the wind, but there was no wind that night. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. It didn't look like a person, at least not exactly. The shape was wrong, tall and narrow, but constantly shifting, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The shimmer pulsed faintly, almost like it was breathing. I grabbed the controls and switched the camera to a different mode. Most of the cameras had a few settings: night vision, infrared, and ultraviolet. Night vision didn't show much, just the usual grainy image of the sheds. Infrared was blank, like the thing wasn't giving off any heat. But when I switched to ultraviolet, it appeared. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. The shimmer turned into a figure, tall and thin, with a body that looked almost liquid. Its skin, or whatever it was, shone in shifting colors like oil on water. It had no face, just a smooth, reflective surface where a head should be. Its arms were long and jointed strangely, bending at angles that didn't make sense. I sat frozen, staring at the screen. It was just standing there, near the shed, moving its head slowly like it was looking around. Then it crouched, pressing a hand, or what looked like a hand, against the ground. It stayed like that for a while, like motionless, like it was studying something. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to call the police, but how would I explain it? There's a shimmering, shape-shifting thing in the parking lot? They'd think I was insane. I thought about going out there myself, but my gut told me to stay put. Whatever it was, it didn't seem like something I wanted to meet face to face. Instead, I kept watching. The figure stayed by the shed for a few more minutes, then stood up and started moving. Its movements were slow, deliberate, almost graceful, like it was floating just above the ground. It headed toward the main building, stopping every so often to crouch or touch something. A patch of grass, a parked car, the side of the wall. I switched between the cameras, trying to follow it as it moved. In normal light, it was almost invisible, just a faint distortion in the air. Only the ultraviolet showed it clearly. I watched as it reached the glass doors of the lobby and paused. It tilted its head, as if it was listening, then stepped right through the glass like it wasn't even there. My heart was pounding. I could feel sweat dripping down my back. I switched to the lobby camera and saw it standing in the middle of the room, its body rippling and shifting like water under sunlight. It moved toward the reception desk, crouching again to touch the floor. Then it turned its head toward the camera. I swear it saw me. I don't know how, but it knew I was watching. The smooth, faceless head tilted slightly, and for a moment the shimmering stopped. It was still, completely still, like a statue. Then it moved again, faster this time, heading toward the elevators. I panicked. My control room was on the second floor, and if it got into the building, I didn't know what it would do. I locked the door and grabbed my flashlight, not that I thought it would help. I just needed to feel like I had something. I watched as it floated into the elevator and pressed a button, or at least it looked like it did. The screen showed the elevator going up. It was coming to my floor. The camera outside the control room showed the hallway. I could see the elevator doors open and the figure stepped out, its body shimmering like a living mirage. It moved slowly down the hall, its long arms brushing against the walls. It stopped outside the door to the control room. I held my breath, clutching the flashlight like it was a weapon. The thing just stood there, motionless. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pressed it against the door. There was no sound, but I could feel the air change, like the pressure in the room shifted. After a moment, it lowered its hand and turned away. I watched on the monitor as it floated back down the hall, into the elevator, and out of the building. It didn't stop until it reached the edge of the property. Then it disappeared into the night. I sat there for hours, too scared to move. When the sun finally came up, I replayed the footage, hoping it would look less terrifying in daylight. But the ultraviolet images were the same, clear as day. I showed the video to my supervisor the next morning, but when we pulled up the files, the ultraviolet feed was gone. Only the normal footage remained, showing nothing but empty hallways and a quiet parking lot. My supervisor told me to take a few days off, said I looked tired. I don't work there anymore. I quit a week later. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the last time I'd see that thing. Sometimes, late at night, I catch a shimmer out of the corner of my eye just for a second. I don't know if it's my imagination or if it's still watching. All I know is I'm never going back to that building. I was part of a 3-plane patrol that night, flying over the northern plains under a sky full of stars. It was the kind of night pilots love. Clear air, no turbulence, and the horizon stretched out endlessly. The mission was straightforward, just routine surveillance. Nothing ever happened on these runs, and I wasn't expecting this one to be any different. We were cruising at 30,000 feet, spread out in a loose V formation. It was quiet except for the hum of the engines and the occasional chatter over the radio. I remember glancing at my instruments, everything reading normal. That's when it started. At first, I thought it was interference, just a low hum bleeding into my headset. It was faint, almost like the static you'd get if the comms weren't tuned right. But then it shifted. The sound wasn't random. It had a pattern, a rhythm, like a melody, but not one I'd ever heard before. It wasn't human. Tower, this is Echo 1, I said, checking in. I'm picking up a strange signal. Is there a weather anomaly in the area? The response was garbled, just static. The signal had drowned them out. Echo 1, come again? Ramirez, flying to my left, called over the squad comms. You're cutting out. Same here, Morales added from the right. Signal's breaking up. Before I could reply, the sound changed. It was clearer now, no longer just a hum. It had depth, layers, instruments that didn't exist, voices that weren't voices, weaving together into something too perfect to be natural. It filled my headset, pushing everything else aside. I could still hear the others talking, but it was distant, like they were behind a wall. The music wasn't just sound. It was something else. It pulled at me, tugging at memories, feelings, things I couldn't even name. I had this overwhelming urge to follow it. Do you hear that? I asked, my voice shaking. Ramirez was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yeah, I hear it. Morales cut in, his voice tighter. What is that? Is it music? None of us could explain it, but we all felt it. The melody seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, as if the air itself was singing. It wasn't just in our headsets, it was in the space around us, vibrating in our bones. And then I saw it. A glimmer, just ahead and below us like moonlight on water. It was faint, but it moved, shimmering in the darkness. There's something out there, I said, leaning forward against my restraints. 9 o'clock, low. Do you see it? Got it, Ramirez replied. What the hell is that? We turned toward it, breaking formation slightly. As we got closer, the glimmer grew brighter, more defined. It wasn't a reflection. It was a craft, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It had no sharp edges, no seams. It was smooth, almost organic, with a faint, silvery glow that seemed to pulse in time with the music. I don't like this, Morales said. We should report back. Radio's useless, Ramirez pointed out. We can't call it in. Stay calm, I said, trying to keep my own nerves in check. Let's get closer, but stay spread out. As we approached, the craft shifted, turning toward us. It didn't have lights like a plane, but its surface rippled, reflecting the stars in a way that made it hard to tell where it ended and the sky began. The music grew louder, more complex, wrapping around us like a physical presence. And then it happened. My jet slowed, not because I pulled back, but because something else was doing it. The controls felt sluggish, like I was flying through syrup. Controls are heavy, Ramirez said. Anyone else? Same here, Morales replied. His voice was shaking now. The craft began to ascend, moving gracefully, almost inviting us to follow. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to. It wasn't like the music was forcing me exactly, but it made the idea of turning away unthinkable. We climbed after it, the three of us, our jets struggling as if the air itself was resisting. The craft led us higher, past 40,000 feet, then 50,000. The stars seemed brighter, closer. My oxygen gauge flickered, and I realized how thin the air was getting. "We can't keep this up," Morales said. "We're going to stall out." The music shifted again, softer now, almost pleading. The craft stopped its climb, hovering in place. We leveled off, circling it at a cautious distance. "It's waiting for us," Ramirez said. "Waiting for what?" I asked. Before anyone could answer, the music surged, filling my head with images. Not pictures exactly, but impressions, shapes, colors, emotions. A sense of distance, of loneliness, of searching. They weren't words, but they were clear. This thing, whatever it was trying to communicate. "It's not hostile," I said, more to myself than anyone else. "How do you know that?" Morales asked. "I just do," I said. "It's asking for something." The craft pulsed, its glow intensifying. The music shifted again, more urgent. Another wave of images flooded my mind. Earth from above, storms rolling across oceans, cities lighting up the night, and then darkness, silence. It was showing us what would happen if something wasn't done. "We need to respond," Ramirez said. "How?" Morales asked. "We don't even know what it wants." I didn't have an answer. None of us did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that turning away now would be wrong. I reached for the manual beacon override, a small device we used in emergencies to send out a distress signal. I activated it, broadcasting an unencrypted pulse. It was primitive, but it was all I could think to do. The craft reacted immediately. Its glow brightened, and the music swelled, almost joyful. It began to ascend again, faster this time, pulling away from us. Within seconds, it was gone, disappearing into the stars. The music faded with it, leaving only the hum of our engines and the vast, empty sky. "What just happened?" Morales asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think we answered," I said. We returned to base in silence, none of us sure how to explain what we'd seen. The debrief was tense, the higher-ups skeptical, but the flight data backed us up. Whatever we'd encountered, it wasn't a malfunction or a trick of the mind. To this day, I don't know what it was or why it reached out to us. But I can't forget the music or the sense that somehow we made a connection. Whatever it wasn't trying to hurt us. It was trying to reach us. I don't even know where to start with this, but I feel like I need to get it out somehow. It happened a few weeks ago when I went on a hiking trip with a couple of friends. We'd planned it for months, just a way to get away from everything for a weekend. The area we picked was a national park, pretty remote. No cell service, hardly any other people around, just the kind of quiet we were looking for. It started on the second day. We were following this old trail that was barely marked anymore. The kind of path where you had to keep an eye out for cairns or blazes on trees. It wasn't anything too difficult, but it was easy to get turned around if you weren't paying attention. That's why we all carried compasses. Phones were useless out there, and we didn't want to rely too much on GPS. We were about halfway through the day's hike when Sarah, one of my friends, noticed her compass wasn't working right. At first, we thought it was just a cheap compass. You know, those knockoff ones that can't hold a steady reading. But then Matt checked his, and it was the same. The needle spun slowly, like it couldn't make up its mind where north was. Mine did the same thing when I pulled it out. It wasn't windy, and we weren't near any big metal structures or anything like that. There shouldn't have been anything to mess with the magnetics, but none of our compasses worked. We thought maybe it was just a weird local phenomenon, like iron deposits in the ground. We laughed it off at first, joking that we'd hit the Bermuda Triangle of the woods. The weird thing was, the compasses weren't just broken. They were pointing somewhere. Not north, but a fixed direction that all three agreed on. It was subtle, like the needles were fighting to stay aligned, but they kept nudging toward the same spot. Curiosity got the better of us. We decided to follow where the compasses were leading. It wasn't part of our planned route, but we figured we could turn back if it got too sketchy. The terrain wasn't too bad, just dense trees and uneven ground. Every so often, we'd stop and check the compasses, and they'd still point the same way. It felt deliberate, like they were leading us somewhere. After about an hour of hiking, the air started to feel different. I know how that sounds, but it's the only way I can describe it. It was heavy, like a storm was about to break, even though the sky was clear. There was no wind, no sound of birds or insects, just us crunching through the underbrush. Sarah was the first to say something about it, and we all agreed it felt off. Then we found it. At first, it just looked like a patch of bare ground in the middle of the forest, maybe 10 feet across. The trees around it were all healthy, but nothing grew in that circle. No grass, no moss, just exposed dirt that looked almost burned, but not quite. In the center of the circle was this thing. It was partially buried, but enough of it stuck out for us to see it wasn't natural. It was metallic, but not shiny. The surface was dull, almost like brushed steel, but darker. It was shaped like a disc, about the size of a car tire lying flat, and there were markings on it. Not letters or symbols, just patterns that didn't make any sense. They weren't random, though. They were too precise, too deliberate. None of us wanted to touch it, but we couldn't stop staring at it. The air felt thicker the closer we got, like it was pressing against our skin. Sarah said she could hear a low hum, but I couldn't hear anything at first. Then Matt said he felt vibrations through his boots when he stood near it. I stepped closer, and that's when I heard it too. A faint, almost musical hum, just at the edge of hearing. It wasn't mechanical, though. It felt alive. We argued about what to do next. Matt wanted to dig it up, see what it was. Sarah said we should mark the spot and report it when we got back to civilization. I just wanted to leave. The thing didn't feel right, like it was watching us even though it didn't have eyes. But curiosity won out, and we started clearing away the dirt around it. As we dug, the thing revealed more of itself. It wasn't just a disc, it was part of something much larger, embedded deep in the ground. The patterns covered the exposed surface, and the hum grew louder. Not deafening, but enough to make your chest vibrate. Then the markings started to glow. It wasn't a bright glow, more like a soft pulse, like the embers of a dying fire. But it wasn't random. The pulses followed a pattern, almost like Morse code. Matt tried to record it on his phone, but it wouldn't turn on. None of our electronics worked. Even Sarah's watch had stopped. That's when we heard the noise. It wasn't coming from the thing, it was coming from above us. A deep, rumbling sound, like something massive shifting in the sky. We looked up, but there was nothing there, just the empty blue sky. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, like it was circling us. Panic set in. Matt tried to cover the thing back up, but the dirt wouldn't stick. It was like the ground had turned slick, almost oily. The hum became a steady tone, and the glowing patterns pulsed faster. We backed away, too scared to keep digging, but too curious to run. Then it stopped. The hum, the glow, the sound from above, everything went silent. The air felt normal again, and the compasses started working. The thing in the ground just sat there, dark and lifeless, like it had been before. But I swear as we turned to leave, I felt it watching us. Not with eyes, but with something else. We didn't talk much on the hike back. When we got to the trailhead, we agreed not to tell anyone. Who would believe us? We didn't take any pictures, and the compasses didn't record their movements. All we had was the memory, and even that felt like it was slipping away. I don't know what we found, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Sometimes when it's quiet, I hear that hum again, faint and distant. I don't know if it's real or just in my head. But whatever that thing was, it wasn't meant for us to find, and I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't done. It was a late afternoon when the first signs of something strange began. I was stationed at a classified airbase in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest city. The place was a black hole of secrecy. If you worked there, you didn't ask too many questions. You followed orders and kept your head down. I had been part of the security detail for months, overseeing routine drills and acting as a liaison for higher-ups whenever they needed things done quickly. That afternoon, we were doing a standard patrol along the perimeter when a low hum filled the air. At first, I thought it was just a helicopter or one of our own planes. But the sound didn't fade, and it didn't have the usual thrum of aircraft engines. It was constant, like an electric hum that seemed to pulse through the ground and into your chest. I remember looking up, expecting to see a plane cutting through the clouds. What I saw instead made my stomach drop. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, some optical illusion, but then it got closer. A strange metallic craft, low enough to make the hum deafening, was descending. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. It wasn't a plane, not even close. The shape was wrong, angular but smooth, almost organic, like something out of science fiction. It wasn't like the UFOs you hear about in stories, no saucers or flying discs. This thing looked like it didn't belong, like it was made by hands that didn't belong to humans. The base immediately went on high alert. Sirens blared and officers scrambled to their posts, but it was too late. The craft hit the ground with a heavy thud, skidding along the desert floor for 100 yards before coming to a stop. I was still frozen in place, not sure if I was dreaming or if this was some kind of elaborate hoax. I had never seen anything like it before in my life. Within minutes, our military personnel surrounded the crash site. The first thing they did was secure the perimeter and start setting up a quarantine zone. I had a bad feeling about it, but I couldn't do anything but follow orders. We all had to stay out of the way while the higher-ups worked out what to do. That's when I saw it. Movement. A small figure emerging from the wreckage. At first I thought it was a person, someone who had survived the crash, but it wasn't a person. It was something else. It stood, maybe 4 feet tall, with skin that was too smooth and too pale, almost translucent. Its eyes were dark, black, and endless. Its limbs were thin, and it moved with an unsettling grace, like it was gliding more than walking. I don't know how long I stood there, unable to move. The officers around me had the same look on their faces: shock, confusion, and, if I'm being honest, fear. The creature, if that's what it was, didn't seem hostile. It didn't charge at us or make any threatening moves. But the moment it saw us, it stopped, tilting its head, studying us like we were the strange ones. Then the orders came. We were to detain it. No one knew exactly what that meant, but we all understood it had to be done. The higher-ups started shouting commands into their radios, and before long, men in hazmat suits moved in to secure the being. They didn't touch it right away. They kept their distance, using equipment I hadn't seen before, long, thin rods that emitted some sort of light and energy field, like they were trying to corral the creature without getting too close. It didn't resist. It didn't seem scared. It just stood there, watching, calm as could be, while they restrained it. At that moment, I realized how out of our depth we were. This was bigger than any operation I had ever been involved with. The creature was placed in a containment unit, and we were told to maintain security. For the next several hours, no one was allowed to approach the crash site, except for a few of the senior officers who seemed to know exactly what to do. I wasn't privy to the details. I didn't know the full scope of what had happened or what the plans were, but it was clear that no one was going to speak about it openly. That night, the airbase became a hub of activity. A dozen high-ranking officers arrived from various agencies. Some of them I recognized, others I didn't. Everyone was on edge. The creature was kept in a secure room, and we were told that our primary job was to keep anyone from getting close. As far as we knew, the alien, if it was one, was being detained for its safety and ours. But the longer the being was held, the stranger things got. We began to hear reports from the scientists and researchers who were working with it. They claimed the creature was trying to communicate, but not in any language we understood. It was as though it was sending signals, thoughts, emotions, impressions, rather than words. Some of the officers thought it was a kind of psychological warfare, an attempt to confuse or disorient us, but others believed it was simply trying to reach out, maybe asking for help. I was pulled into a meeting with the commanding officer, Colonel Morgan. He looked like a man who had seen too much, his face drawn and serious as he spoke. "We need to figure out what we're dealing with," he said, his voice low. "This thing has information. It knows something." We were all told to maintain radio silence, to avoid contact with outside agencies or the public. I'm not sure what they were hoping to achieve by that. Maybe they didn't want panic to set in. Over the next few days, it became clear that whatever this creature was, it wasn't alone. We started hearing rumors that something was coming for it. Higher-ups were tight-lipped, but whispers spread. I overheard a conversation between two men in the break room. They were talking about the possibility of an interstellar war or conflict. They spoke of pursuers, entities that had tracked the creature here to Earth. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. But the thought of something else, something far worse than the creature in the containment unit, made my skin crawl. As the days passed, I started noticing the subtle changes, tensions building among the personnel. Guards were more on edge. The lights in the containment room flickered at odd times. Sometimes you'd hear noises coming from within, a tapping or scraping sound, like the being was trying to break free. The atmosphere on the base became suffocating, like everyone knew something was wrong but didn't know how to handle it. Then, one day, without warning, everything changed. The alien, it must have been desperate, used its strange form of communication to influence the minds of the guards. I don't know how it happened, but in the blink of an eye, the security detail in the room was incapacitated. Some of the men began to scream, others stood motionless, staring into the empty space like they were in a trance. I don't know if it was intentional or if it was some kind of accident, but the creature escaped. It didn't take long for the pursuit to start. I don't know how they tracked it, but within hours, the base was under lockdown. Helicopters flew overhead, search parties were deployed, and every single man on that base was ordered to find the alien, dead or alive. We didn't get a lot of details, but we all understood the gravity of the situation. If this creature wasn't found, the consequences would be unimaginable. By the time the search ended, the base was quiet again. The creature was never found. Some said it had left. Others whispered it had been taken back. No one really knew. All I know is that when the whole thing was over, the base returned to normal. No one spoke of the incident, and the people involved were quietly reassigned or dismissed. And me? I was left wondering what would have happened if we'd made a different choice, if we'd acted differently, if we'd listened to the creature, or if we'd helped it when it asked. In the end, we just sealed it all away, buried it deep under layers of secrecy. But sometimes when I lay awake at night, I wonder what we've really lost by keeping it all hidden. I never expected to get famous. I started posting videos just for fun like everyone else. It was simple stuff, outfits of the day, trying out weird food trends, little updates about my life. I wasn't trying to be anything special. I was just bored, and it felt like something to do. Then, one day, everything changed. It started with one video. I remember it because I almost didn't post it. It was just me talking about this strange dream I'd had. I don't even know why I decided to share it. In the dream, I was standing in a massive empty room with walls that glowed faintly blue. There were shapes in the distance, tall, thin figures that seemed to be watching me. I couldn't move, but I didn't feel scared either. It was like they were waiting for something. When I woke up, the details were already fading, but the feeling stuck with me. So I grabbed my phone and recorded a quick video about it. I thought it was weird enough that some people might find it interesting, but nothing more than that. The next morning, it had over 1 million views. At first, I thought it was a glitch. I refreshed the app a dozen times, but the number kept climbing. The comments were pouring in, thousands of them. People were saying they'd had similar dreams, that they'd seen the same blue room, the same figures. Others said the way I described it felt familiar, even though they couldn't explain why. That's when my follower count started exploding. Every time I refreshed, there were more. 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. Within a week, I was at 1 million. Brands started reaching out, offering sponsorships. My inbox was full of messages from people saying they felt like they knew me, like I'd spoken directly to them. It felt unreal. I kept telling myself it was just luck that the algorithm had picked up my video and run with it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The dreams didn't stop. If anything, they got more vivid. I started seeing the figures more clearly. They were tall, with elongated limbs and smooth, featureless faces. Their skin shimmered like it was made of liquid metal. They didn't speak, but I could feel them, like their thoughts were pressing into mine. They wanted something from me, but I didn't know what. The strange thing was, the more I dreamed about them, the more my followers grew. Every time I woke up, I'd check my phone, and there would be thousands more people watching me. My videos were trending constantly, even the ones that didn't seem special. I could post a 30-second clip of me brushing my hair, and it would get millions of views. People started calling me relatable and authentic. They said they felt connected to me, like I was different from other influencers. I didn't feel different. I felt confused. Then the messages started. At first, they were just weird comments on my posts, things like "they're watching" or "you're the bridge." I thought it was some kind of internet joke I didn't understand, but then I started getting emails. They didn't have subject lines or sender names, just blocks of text that didn't make sense. The connection is stabilizing. Do resist. Do not resist. You are the prototype, the others will follow. The message must be delivered. I deleted them, but they kept coming. No matter how many times I blocked the addresses, they always found a way through. One night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint hum, but it made my skin crawl. I looked around my room, but everything seemed normal. My phone was on the nightstand, the screen glowing faintly. There was a new notification, another email. This one was different. It wasn't text, it was a video. It started with static, then cut to a view of the blue room from my dreams. The camera was moving, like someone was walking through the space. The figures were there, standing in a circle, their heads tilted toward the camera. One of them raised a hand, and the screen went black. When it came back, I was in the video. Not a recording of me. Me, standing in the blue room, wearing the same pajamas I had on in bed. I was frozen, staring blankly ahead. One of the figures stepped closer, reaching out toward me, and the video ended. I threw my phone across the room. The next day, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just a nightmare, that my brain was messing with me. But when I opened the app, there was a new video on my account. I hadn't posted it. It was the same video from the email, the blue room, the figures, me standing among them. It already had 10 million views. I panicked. I tried to delete it, but the app wouldn't let me. Every time I refreshed, the views climbed higher. The comments were full of people saying they'd had dreams about the room, that they'd seen the figures too. Some of them said they'd seen me there. That was when I realized this wasn't just about me. I didn't know what to do. I thought about quitting, deleting my account, disappearing completely, but it didn't feel like that would stop anything. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than me. The dreams kept coming, but they were different now. The figures weren't just watching me, they were showing me things. Cities covered in light, strange machines that moved like they were alive, stars I didn't recognize. I felt their thoughts more clearly, like they were trying to teach me something. They called it the bridge, and I was the key. I don't remember how I finally got out. One night the dreams stopped. The figures were gone, and the blue room faded away. My follower count leveled off, and the strange comments disappeared. It was like they decided I wasn't useful anymore. I still don't know what they wanted. Maybe they were testing me, or maybe I failed their test. All I know is they're still out there watching, waiting for someone else to become their bridge. I've stopped posting. I don't even use social media anymore. Sometimes I wonder if they're still keeping an eye on me, but I try not to think about it. The blue room is gone, and I'm just glad I got out alive. I sell roasted chestnuts on a busy street corner in the city. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills. My cart sits at the intersection of two crowded streets, where office workers rush past, parents wrangle their kids, and tourists snap pictures of everything. I like the noise and the movement. It makes the day go faster. Most people don't stick around long. Just grab a paper bag of chestnuts, maybe smile, maybe nod, and keep going. But some nights, the crowd thins out and things get strange. It started about 3 weeks ago. A man approached the cart, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me. His face was pale and his eyes were strange, too wide, too shiny. I thought maybe he didn't speak English, so I smiled and held up a bag of chestnuts. "One bag?" I asked. He didn't respond, just tilted his head slightly like he was studying me. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out exact change, and placed it on the counter. I handed him the chestnuts, and he walked away without a word. At first, I didn't think much of it. Plenty of people are quiet, especially in the city. But then, the next night, he came back. Same thing. No words, no expression, just exact change and that same intense stare. It wasn't just him either. 2 nights later, a woman showed up. She looked a lot like the man, tall, pale, with that same strange shine in her eyes. She didn't speak, just stared at me like I was a puzzle she was trying to solve. She paid with exact change and left without eating the chestnuts. That's when I started to notice something weird. These customers didn't move like other people. Their steps were too smooth, like they were gliding instead of walking. And their faces, they didn't have any of the little twitches or movements that make people look alive. They were too still, like mannequins. By the end of the week, there were more of them. Not every night, but often enough that I noticed. They always came alone, always silent, always with exact change. None of them ate the chestnuts, at least not that I saw. I started to feel uneasy, but I couldn't explain why. They didn't do anything wrong. They just stood there, staring. Then one night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. It was a slow evening, with barely anyone around. One of the quiet ones, a man in a gray scarf, came up to the cart. He reached into his pocket for change, but before he pulled it out, I had this strange feeling in my head. It's hard to describe. It was like a pressure, like someone was pushing on my thoughts, trying to dig through them. I froze, my hand hovering over the chestnuts. The pressure got stronger, and suddenly, I wasn't just thinking my own thoughts anymore. I was thinking his thoughts too. Or maybe he was thinking mine. I couldn't tell. There weren't words exactly, just impressions, questions, curiosity. I felt like he was looking at my memories, flipping through them like pages in a book. I tried to speak, but my mouth wouldn't work. My mind felt like it was split open, and all my private thoughts were spilling out. I thought about my sister, who I hadn't called in weeks. I thought about the time I accidentally shortchanged a customer and felt too embarrassed to fix it. I thought about the scar on my hand from when I burned it on the cart stove. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the pressure was gone. The man handed me his coins, took the chestnuts, and walked away like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to make sense of it. The way he stared at me, the way it felt like he knew me in a way no one ever should. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. These people weren't normal. Over the next few nights, I started watching them more closely. They never spoke to anyone, never stayed in one place for long. They didn't seem to interact with each other either. But every time one of them came to my cart, I felt that same pressure in my head. It was softer, less overwhelming, but still there. Like they were skimming the surface of my thoughts, not digging too deep. One night, I decided to test it. I thought about something random, an old cartoon I used to watch as a kid. I focused on the theme song, humming it in my head as I handed a bag of chestnuts to one of them. The figure tilted its head just slightly, like it had heard me. Then it walked away. I knew then that they were reading my thoughts. They didn't need to talk because they already knew what I was going to say. The realization made my skin crawl. What else had they seen? What else did they know? I started feeling paranoid. Every time I saw one of them, I tried to block out my thoughts, to keep my mind blank. But it's impossible not to think. The more I tried, the more I felt like they were in control, like they were leading my thoughts where they wanted them to go. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. A woman approached the cart, tall, pale, silent. I slammed my hand on the counter and said, "What do you want from me?" She didn't flinch. Her eyes met mine, and for a second, I felt that pressure again, stronger than ever. Then, just as quickly, it disappeared. She reached into her pocket, placed exact change on the counter, and walked away without taking the chestnuts. I almost quit that night. I packed up the cart and went home, shaking. But as scared as I was, I couldn't stop thinking about them. Who were they? What were they doing here? And why did they keep coming to me? The next night, I decided to confront them. I waited until one of them showed up, a man in a black coat. When he handed me the coins, I grabbed his wrist. It felt cold, too cold, like touching ice. "Why are you here?" I asked. "What are you looking for?" He didn't speak, but I felt the answer in my head. It wasn't words exactly, but a feeling. Curiosity, observation. He wasn't here to hurt me, none of them were. They were just studying, watching how people lived, how we thought. They didn't understand speech, so they used thoughts instead. To them it was normal, but to me it felt like a violation. The man pulled his hand away and walked off without another word or thought. That was the last night I saw them. It's been 2 weeks, and they haven't come back. But I can't stop thinking about them, about the way they peeled back my mind like a book. They didn't hurt me, but they left something behind, a question I can't answer. What do we owe to privacy, to consent, when it comes to beings who don't see the world the way we do? I still sell chestnuts on the same corner, but every time I see a tall figure in the crowd, my heart skips a beat. I don't know if they'll come back, but if they do, I'll be ready. At least, I hope I will be. I've been hiking alone for years. It's my thing, really. The quiet of the woods, the solitude of a long trek, far from the noise of city life, nothing beats it. That's what made me take the trip to the park that day. It wasn't my first time there, and I was looking forward to a long, peaceful walk along the river trail. But I can't explain it. Something felt different about that day. The weather had been odd that morning. There was a strange stillness in the air. But I didn't think much of it. It wasn't until I was well into my hike, just past the old trail markers, that the feeling started to settle in. It wasn't just the air, it was the whole place. The trees seemed quieter than usual. Even the river seemed to be running slower, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I had been walking for a few hours when I reached a part of the trail I hadn't seen before. The path veered down to a small, secluded part of the riverbank where the trees crowded in closer and everything felt a little more enclosed. The water was clear, the kind of clear you don't see in many places. It was a spot I would have passed by without thinking, but something drew me closer. Maybe it was the perfect spot to sit down and rest for a while. I'd barely taken a few steps toward the river when I noticed something strange. There was a figure sitting at the water's edge, just ahead of me. At first, I thought it was someone else, another hiker, maybe someone who had taken the same trail, but the closer I got, the more I realized how wrong I was. This person wasn't human. It was sitting still, almost like it was waiting for something, just watching the river. At first, I couldn't make out any details. It was like a silhouette blurred by the trees and the shadows. But as I got closer, everything about it started to become clearer. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen. The figure was tall, though not in a way that felt unnatural. Its posture was rigid but calm. It was sitting cross-legged by the riverbank, staring at the water in front of it. I couldn't see its face clearly, but there was something about it that made the hairs on my neck stand up. The way the figure was dressed, or rather how its body seemed to be covered, wasn't fabric or any material I could recognize. It shimmered, like the light was bending around it. It almost looked like the figure was part of the landscape itself, blending in with the surroundings. I stopped dead in my tracks. For a moment, I thought about turning around and heading back down the trail, but my legs wouldn't move. I just stood there, staring at it. I knew it was wrong to stare, but I couldn't look away. My mind raced, wondering what I was looking at, but a strange calmness washed over me, almost like I was being hypnotized by the stillness of the scene. And then it did something. The figure, this thing, moved its head. Not like it had just noticed me, but more like it was acknowledging my presence. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. The air felt thick, heavy, like I was holding my breath without realizing it. That's when it happened. The thing, it spoke to me. Not with words, not out loud, but in my mind. A presence, an understanding. It was like it had been waiting for me to approach, like it knew I was coming. I could hear its thoughts, or at least I could feel them. They weren't human thoughts, but somehow they felt familiar, like the way you can just tell when someone is staring at you, even if you can't see them. It didn't speak in any language I could understand, but it didn't need to. The message was simple and unmistakable. Something is coming. I stood there, utterly still, as the sense of urgency washed over me. The figure didn't move, but the message grew stronger in my mind. It wasn't a warning in the way we usually think of warnings. There wasn't any fear in it, no panic. It wasn't threatening. It was just a fact, a statement, like telling someone it's going to rain. And then, without another movement, the figure turned its gaze back to the river. I didn't know what to do, what to say, or even how to feel. Part of me wanted to ask what it meant, but I knew I wasn't supposed to. I wasn't supposed to speak. I just had to understand what it had told me. Before I could take another step, it happened again. Only this time, I didn't hear it in my mind. I felt it. The ground beneath me trembled, just slightly, like something far off was shifting. The air grew thick again, this time colder, heavier. It felt like the world was holding its breath, just like the forest had been earlier that morning. The figure's presence faded, and I felt a strange pull in my chest. It wasn't physical, but it felt like I was being gently tugged, like the earth itself was trying to get my attention. The figure was still there, but I knew it was time to leave. Something was coming. I turned and walked away from the riverbank, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the creature. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it wasn't a being from this world. It wasn't human. It wasn't like anything I'd ever read about, not in science fiction or in the folklore I had learned over the years. But I also knew that it wasn't dangerous. It didn't want to hurt me. It had only wanted to share its warning, and now that it had, it was done. As I walked back down the trail, my mind was racing. What had it meant? What was coming? I didn't know, but there was a quiet certainty that I couldn't shake. There was no urgency in its words, no panic, but the message was unmistakable. Something was coming. When I finally made it back to the main trail, I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure still sitting there, but it was gone. The forest was calm again, the air lighter. It was like nothing had ever happened. But I knew something was wrong. I didn't know how I knew, but I knew. I don't know if anyone else would have believed me if I'd told them about it. I don't know if anyone would have understood. But that night I couldn't sleep. The message kept echoing in my mind. Something was coming. The next day I found out. The local news reported it. A landslide in the nearby mountains, a massive one. A whole section of the trail had been wiped out. The damage was extensive. No one was hurt, thank God, but the destruction was worse than anything anyone had anticipated. I don't know if the creature was warning me about the landslide or if it was something else entirely. I'm not sure what it meant when it said, something is coming, but I don't think it was just about the landslide. It didn't feel like just an ordinary disaster. I haven't been back to that trail since. I don't think I'll go back. Maybe I was meant to see that creature. Maybe I wasn't. But I'll never forget the look in its eyes or the message it gave me. Something was coming. And whatever it was, I wasn't ready for it. I've been meaning to write this down for a while. I've been putting it off, mostly because I didn't want anyone to think I was crazy, but maybe it'll help me make sense of everything, or at least get it out of my head. It's been a few months since it happened, but I still think about it every day. I was diagnosed with cancer about a year ago. It wasn't even that surprising, honestly. I had been feeling off for a while, but when I finally went to the doctor, I guess I was kind of expecting the worst. What they told me, though, was worse than I could have imagined. Stage 4, they said. Too advanced. They told me I had maybe 6 months at best, a year if I was lucky. They didn't sugarcoat it. It wasn't a fight anymore, it was just waiting. The chemotherapy didn't help, it just drained me. I lost weight, I couldn't keep anything down. I spent most of my days lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling my body slowly betray me. My family tried to stay positive, but I could see it in their eyes. They knew too. I could feel the weight of it all, like a shadow that followed me everywhere. The best I could do was hold on for them. I tried to keep going for their sake, but after a while, even the simplest tasks felt impossible. I couldn't remember the last time I felt healthy. Then one night, it all changed. I was in my room, lying in bed, trying to sleep. The house was quiet, and it was late, maybe around 2 or 3 in the morning. My body ached in ways I didn't know were possible. My chest felt heavy and my head was pounding. I hadn't been able to sleep properly in days, so I just lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the dark ceiling, wishing for some kind of relief. And then I heard something. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it was a sound. Not from the outside, no cars, no sirens, no normal noises. It was inside the room, like something was shifting in the air. I couldn't see anything at first, but there was a faint humming, almost like the sound of an electric motor running, or maybe a distant drone. It didn't feel right. It felt wrong, but also familiar, like I'd heard it before, but couldn't place where. I tried to sit up, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I couldn't move, I was too weak. My eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything that would explain what was going on. That's when I saw it. Standing at the foot of my bed was a figure. It wasn't human, not in any way I could describe. It was tall, probably over 7 feet, and its shape wasn't solid, not like a person. It was shifting, like it was made of smoke or liquid, a form that couldn't stay still. There were no eyes, but I could feel it looking at me, and there was this overwhelming presence, a pressure, like the air was thickening around me. I don't know how I knew, but I understood immediately. This wasn't just a hallucination or a fever dream. This was real. The figure moved closer, and I froze, unable to move. I felt its intentions, I guess. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't angry, it didn't seem to have any malice, but there was something else, something older than anything I had ever felt. It reached out slowly, and its hand, if you could call it that, hovered just above my chest. It didn't speak, but somehow I understood what it wanted to say. It wasn't through words, not like how we communicate. It was just this knowing. It told me it could cure me. It said it could make the cancer go away, heal me completely. It was offering me a way out of the pain, out of the slow, miserable decline I'd been enduring. It was offering me life again. But there was a catch. I felt it right away. The catch wasn't something I could ignore, no matter how tempting the offer was. It wasn't just a simple cure. It was more than that. This entity, whatever it was, wanted something from me. It needed something, and it wasn't subtle about it. It said it would take something in exchange for the healing, a price, a sacrifice. I didn't know what that meant at the time, but I could feel the weight of it. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. It wasn't a simple transaction. It wasn't like buying a medicine or getting a treatment. It was something deeper. It wanted my soul in a way. Not in the literal sense, but in the way that meant my humanity would be compromised. I would be changed, altered, forever. I thought about it. I thought about my family. I thought about all the things I would never get to do, all the things I would miss. I thought about how tired I was of suffering, how much I wanted to see my kids grow up, how much I wanted to see another sunrise, another season change. I thought about how desperate I was, how I was willing to do anything to escape the constant pain. But then I thought about the cost. I thought about how the price wasn't just my body, it was my very essence, my beliefs, everything I had known and stood for. And I said no. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't have to. I just rejected the offer. The figure paused for a moment, like it was considering something, weighing my response, and then, almost like it was understanding, it withdrew. The figure didn't vanish immediately, but it started to fade, the shifting form slowly dissipating into the air, leaving behind only the faintest trace of that strange hum. The room was quiet again, and I could move. I was still weak, but I could move my arms and legs again, and I sat up, feeling the cold sweat on my forehead. The next day, I went to the doctor, and for the first time in months, I got some good news. The cancer had shrunk. I was still sick, but it wasn't as bad. The tumor wasn't gone, but it was smaller. I had a chance. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened that night. I couldn't. How could I? How could I explain that some strange alien had offered to heal me, but I turned it down because the price was too high? But I've thought about it every day since. I can't stop thinking about it. I don't know if I had accepted. Maybe I would have been cured. Maybe I would have lived longer, but at what cost? I don't know. But I do know this. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just a healer. It was something much older, something beyond us, beyond our understanding. And I don't think I'll ever truly understand what it was offering or what it wanted in return. I'm still alive, and I'm grateful for that. I don't know how much longer I'll be here, but I know that I won't forget what happened. And I don't think I'll ever forget the weight of that choice. I've spent most of my life digging through dirt, sand, and rock, trying to piece together what was left behind by people long gone. It's not glamorous, and it's not exciting most of the time. Um, movies make it seem like it's all about treasure, but real archaeology is slow and careful. You spend hours, days, even weeks, brushing off layers of earth, cataloging fragments, and hoping something significant comes out of it. Usually it doesn't. But this time was different. This time, I found something I shouldn't have. The dig site was in the middle of nowhere, out in the desert. We were working on what we thought was an ancient burial site, maybe a temple. The usual things came up at first: broken pottery, stone carvings, animal bones. Nothing unusual, but we were thorough. You have to be. You never know when something small will change everything. About a week in, we uncovered a chamber. It wasn't on any of the preliminary scans, so we weren't expecting it. The entrance was sealed with a heavy slab of stone, covered in symbols I didn't recognize. I've studied a lot of ancient scripts, but this wasn't anything I'd seen before. It wasn't even close. We managed to get the slab open, and inside there was a table, or something like it. It was made of a dark, smooth material that didn't look like stone or metal. On the table were a set of documents. They were laid out in an orderly fashion, not like they'd been abandoned, but like someone had placed them there, waiting to be found. The documents were strange. They weren't written on paper or parchment or anything organic. The material was thin and translucent, almost like glass, but flexible. The writing on them wasn't anything I recognized either. Not Egyptian, not Sumerian, not anything I'd studied. But it wasn't random. It was precise, almost mechanical. I felt uneasy right away. There was something off about the chamber. The air felt heavy, and the walls seemed to hum faintly. I thought it might just be nerves. Finding something like this was a big deal, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. We took the documents back to the base camp to analyze them. I started trying to decode the symbols, but it was slow going. After a couple of days, I noticed something strange. The symbols weren't just writing, they were shifting, almost like they were alive. If I looked at them long enough, they seemed to change slightly, just enough to make me question what I'd seen. Then came the breakthrough. One of the team members, a linguist named Sarah, figured out part of the system. It wasn't a language, it was a code. And once we started cracking it, the pieces fell into place. The documents weren't just records, they were a treaty. It was a peace agreement, signed thousands of years ago. But it wasn't between nations or tribes, it was between humans and something else. The text described beings not of this world, who had come to Earth long before recorded history. They'd made contact, but something had gone wrong. There had been a war, and this treaty was the result. The details were vague, but the treaty promised coexistence. The beings would leave, but only under specific conditions. Humanity was supposed to maintain something. The balance, the text called it. I didn't understand what that meant, but it seemed important. At first, we thought it was some kind of myth, like the stories of gods and monsters you find in every ancient culture. But then the messages started. The first one came over the radio. It wasn't a voice, just a series of tones, almost like music, but dissonant and unsettling. We thought it was interference, maybe from a satellite or a nearby station. But then the tones started repeating, forming patterns. It was a signal. The second message was clearer. It came through the camp's communication system, a voice this time, but not human. It was deep and resonant, speaking in a language none of us understood. But somehow we felt what it was saying. It wasn't words, it was emotions. Anger, disappointment, warning. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The camp was silent except for the occasional whisper of the wind and the hum of our equipment. I kept staring at the documents, trying to make sense of them. The symbols seemed to mock me, shifting and changing, refusing to give up their secrets. The next day, we noticed the sky. It wasn't right. The sun was there, but the light was dimmer and the shadows were sharper. It felt like we were being watched, but no one said it out loud. We didn't have to. That night, they came. I was in my tent, poring over the documents when I felt it. The air pressure dropped suddenly, like before a storm, but there was no wind. The humming sound from the chamber was back, louder this time. I stepped outside and saw them. They weren't what I expected. They weren't little green men or bug-eyed monsters. They were tall, impossibly tall, and they shimmered like they were made of light and shadow at the same time. They didn't walk, they hovered, gliding silently across the ground. One of them approached me. I couldn't move, I couldn't even breathe. It raised a hand, or what I thought was a hand, and I felt its presence in my mind. It didn't speak, but I understood. You broke the treaty. I didn't know what it meant. I wanted to say that I didn't know, that it wasn't my fault, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. It wasn't anger I felt from it. It was sadness, disappointment. The others were frozen too, standing like statues as the beings moved among us. They didn't touch anything, didn't harm anyone, they just observed. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they were gone. The humming stopped and the air felt normal again. But we knew they weren't finished. We left the site the next day. We didn't pack up the camp properly, just grabbed what we could carry and drove out. No one spoke. We didn't have to. We all knew the same thing. The beings were watching, waiting. They weren't angry, not yet, but they were waiting for something. I don't know what happened to the documents. The organization that funded the dig took over, and we were told not to talk about what we'd seen. I don't know if anyone else will believe me, but I had to write this down. Maybe it's a warning, maybe it's just a record. But I know one thing for sure. They're still out there, and they haven't forgotten. It's hard for me to even talk about this now, but I need to get it out. I never thought something like this could happen to me, and honestly, I wish it hadn't. But I'm writing this now because I need to remember what happened, even if it's something I'd rather forget. I'm a single mom. I have a 7-year-old son, Luke, and I'm just trying to make it day by day. Life's always been a bit of a struggle, but it's nothing I couldn't handle. I've had to work extra hard at times, balancing a job, taking care of Luke, keeping everything together. It wasn't always easy, but I made it work. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. But then, everything changed. It started one night about 3 months ago. It wasn't anything special at first. I was sitting in the living room reading while Luke was asleep in his room. I had just finished a long shift at the diner where I worked, and I was looking forward to some quiet time. The house was dark except for the lamp next to me, and I was halfway through a book I had started when I heard something outside. I don't know why I even bothered getting up. It's a quiet neighborhood, and it's not like we get much traffic. But something about that noise, the way it was so out of place, caught my attention. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, but there was something strange about the rhythm. Almost mechanical. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just a raccoon or a neighbor, I thought. But then the light on the porch flickered. It's hard to describe what happened next, but I'll try. The light on the porch flashed 3 times, like someone was signaling. Then it went out. I stood up from the chair, heart pounding, and walked to the window, just to check. But there was nothing there. No one. The street was empty, and the only thing moving was the wind rustling the trees. I tried to shake it off. I figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me, Or maybe the house was just old and the light needed replacing. So I went back to my book. But that's when it happened. A voice. It wasn't like a normal voice. It didn't come from outside or even from the air. It felt like it was coming from inside my mind, but it wasn't a thought of mine. It was clear, calm, and distant, but still close enough for me to feel it. "Do not be afraid," the voice said. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. My heart was racing, but I didn't feel scared. I felt curious. The voice wasn't threatening. It was just there. "We need your help," it continued. "You are the one we've chosen." I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like forever. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. I snapped out of the trance I had fallen into and quickly turned on all the lights in the house. I didn't know what had just happened, but I felt shaken, like my brain was still trying to process it. I checked on Luke, who was still sound asleep in his bed, and then I grabbed my phone, trying to calm myself down. I thought I was going crazy. I even checked the news, thinking maybe I'd heard something about new technology or some kind of mental health issue, but there was nothing. I figured maybe I'd just been too tired, maybe the stress was getting to me. But it didn't feel like that. The next few days were strange, too. Little things started to happen that I couldn't explain. I kept feeling like I was being watched. I heard footsteps that weren't mine, whispers that didn't belong to anyone, and the weirdest part was that it felt like the house was changing. Not physically, but emotionally, like the air was different somehow. One night, while I was making dinner, the voice came back. "We are here," it said, but this time it felt more present, more real. I didn't feel scared, but I was nervous. I didn't know what was happening. "We are in you." And then it hit me. This wasn't just a voice. Something was inside me. That's when it all became clear. The voice explained, in pieces, that they had chosen me, not by accident, but because of something inside me. It wasn't just a random selection. They had been watching, waiting, and they said I had the perfect qualities to help them. I wasn't sure what to believe at first. It felt too surreal to be true, but the more it spoke, the more I understood. The voice wasn't just one being, it was many, it was collective. They were a species, far from Earth, and they had been observing us for years, and they needed someone like me to help them communicate with humans, to help bridge the gap between their world and ours. It wasn't that they were hostile, not at all. They needed empathy, human empathy. They said I was the right one because I had an ability to understand others, to feel what they felt, to connect. But it wasn't just about being kind or caring. It was deeper. They said that the emotions humans experience, especially the ones tied to love, pain, and fear, were the key to understanding them. I was supposed to become the host, the ambassador, so they could connect with humanity. But there was a price. I didn't understand at first. It wasn't like they were forcing me to do anything. But it became clear over time that the longer they were inside me, the more I would change. They weren't going to leave once they settled in. It wasn't just an exchange of knowledge. It was a bond, a merging. My personality, my emotions, my very sense of self would become intertwined with theirs. I didn't know what to do. There was so much going on in my life already. Luke needed me. He was my priority. How could I do this to him? How could I bring something alien into our lives? But at the same time, I understood. I felt this sense of responsibility, like I was meant for this, like I had no choice. The voice said I had a choice. It always said that. But it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like I had already been chosen, that my life was no longer just mine. I thought about the consequences. I thought about how Luke might react, about how the world would react. I thought about how much of myself I would lose. But in the end, I agreed. I didn't do it lightly, but I thought about it long and hard. I couldn't just turn my back on them, especially when I understood what they were trying to do. They weren't trying to take over the world or harm anyone. They needed someone who could connect with people, someone who understood how to help and communicate, and they said they would never hurt me. But the process was slow. I wouldn't see the changes immediately, but they would happen. It wasn't like an instant transformation, but I started noticing little things. My thoughts felt clearer, more focused. I could sense things around me in ways I hadn't before. Sometimes I would know what people were feeling before they even spoke. I could tell when something was wrong with Luke, even when he didn't say anything. The voice didn't speak as often, but I felt it in the back of my mind, always present, always watching. I'm still me, at least in some ways. But there are parts of me that have changed. I think differently now. I understand things in ways I didn't before. Sometimes I feel a little distant from myself, like I'm not entirely in control of my emotions. The alien presence inside me is there, like a quiet hum beneath everything I do. It's been hard. Balancing all of this with being a mother, with living my life, is exhausting. Some days, it's hard to tell where I end and they begin. But Luke is fine. He doesn't know what's happened to me, and I don't plan on telling him. I don't think he would understand. I still don't know what the long-term effects will be, but I guess I'll find out. It's too late to turn back now. I'm doing what I was chosen for, and somehow that makes it easier to bear. But every day I wonder if I made the right choice. In the end, it wasn't just about saving myself. It was about saving all of us. It started as a normal camping trip. There were 4 of us. Me, my brother Ethan, and 2 of our friends, Mike and Jenna. We picked this spot deep in the woods because it was supposed to have the clearest skies for stargazing. None of us were experts or anything, but we liked looking at the stars, and it was a good excuse to get away from the city. The first night was uneventful. We set up camp, made a fire, and stayed up late talking. The sky was as clear as promised. You could see everything, more stars than I had ever noticed before. We even saw a few shooting stars. It felt peaceful. The second night, things started to feel different. It was subtle at first. The air got colder, even though the forecast said it would stay warm. The woods around us got quieter too. No wind, no insects, no rustling leaves, just silence, except for us. It was like everything around us was holding its breath. We ignored it at first. We were sitting around the fire when Mike pointed out something weird about the sky. He said it looked like it was moving. At first, I thought he was just imagining things, but then we all saw it. The stars weren't where they had been the night before. They were shifting like ripples in a pond after you throw a rock in. Ethan said it was probably just some kind of atmospheric phenomenon like heat waves or auroras, but it didn't feel natural. The stars didn't just distort, they moved, bending and twisting, like someone was stirring them. Jenna thought it was amazing and wanted to take pictures, but her phone wouldn't turn on. None of our electronics worked. Even the flashlight flickered and went out. The fire started acting weird too. The flames stretched upward like they were being pulled and then froze. They didn't flicker or move, just held still, frozen mid-dance. The light stayed the same, but it didn't feel warm anymore. We were all staring at it, too stunned to say anything, when the ground started vibrating. It wasn't an earthquake. It was too rhythmic, like a heartbeat, slow and steady. We could feel it through the soles of our shoes, but nothing around us was shaking. The trees stood perfectly still, and the ground didn't crack or shift. It was just that steady, unnatural thrum. Jenna was the first to speak. She said she felt dizzy, like the ground wasn't solid anymore. Mike agreed, and I started to notice it too. It felt like we were standing on something that wasn't quite there, like the forest had turned into a picture of itself and we were standing inside it. Everything looked the same, but it didn't feel real. Then the sky above us split open. I don't know how else to describe it. One moment it was just rippling, and the next it peeled back, like someone was unzipping the night. Behind it was something else. Not space, not more stars, just a blank, endless void. It wasn't black or white. It didn't have a color at all. It was just nothing. We couldn't move. We couldn't look away. The stars we had been staring at were gone, replaced by this empty, endless void. And then something came through it. It wasn't a ship, not in the way you think of ships anyway. It was like a massive, floating shape made of light and shadow, constantly shifting. It didn't have a fixed form. One moment it looked like a sphere. The next, it stretched into something like a spiral or a tower. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't see-through either. It was just there, hovering silently above us. The vibrations in the ground stopped, but now we could hear something. a low hum so deep it felt like it was inside us, vibrating in our bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, like pressure, like the air was too thick to breathe. Mike tried to say something, but no sound came out. He looked terrified, and so did the rest of us. Then the bubble appeared. I don't know when it started, but suddenly we were surrounded by a faint shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising off pavement. It formed a dome around us, enclosing our campsite and part of the forest. Beyond it, everything was distorted, like looking through a warped lens. The trees outside bent and stretched, and the ground looked like it was tilting away from us. Inside the bubble, time felt strange. The fire was still frozen, but the light didn't seem to fade or flicker. The hum grew louder, and we started seeing flashes of light in the air, like tiny sparks that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. The floating shape in the sky didn't move closer, but it didn't go away either. It just hung there, shifting and changing. Then beams of light shot down from it. They weren't like searchlights or lasers. They were soft, almost misty, but they moved with purpose, scanning the ground. One of them swept over our campsite, and I swear for a second I couldn't feel my body. It was like I was weightless, floating, but still standing in the same spot. When the light passed, the hum faded, and the shimmering dome around us began to collapse. It didn't vanish all at once. It shrank, pulling inward toward the floating shape above. As it did, the frozen fire flickered back to life, and the woods outside returned to normal. We could hear the wind again, and the cold air started to feel natural. When the dome was gone, the shape in the sky pulsed once, like it was taking a breath, and then it slipped back through the rip in the sky. The void closed behind it, sealing up like it had never been there. The stars snapped back into place, and the night was normal again. None of us said a word. We just sat there, staring at the fire, trying to process what had happened. When we finally spoke, we couldn't agree on what we'd seen. Jenna thought it was some kind of advanced technology. Mike thought it was a natural phenomenon we didn't understand. Ethan refused to talk about it at all. We packed up and left at first light. None of us wanted to stay another night in that place. Even now, I don't know what it was. I don't think I'll ever know. But sometimes when I look at the night sky, I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to come back. I don't really know how to start this, and I've been putting it off for as long as I can, but I guess at some point I have to get it out. It's been a while since it happened, but the memory is still so clear. It's like it just happened yesterday, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. I'd been flying for most of my life. A career pilot, you could say. Not military, not commercial, just flying planes for a living. After all those years in the cockpit, I finally decided it was time to retire. I was ready to hang it all up. One last flight, just me and the sky. A solo trip, nothing fancy. Just a way to say goodbye to something I'd loved for decades. I picked a quiet route, something peaceful. No need for any grand adventure, just the calm of flying alone again. I took off in the early morning, the sun still low in the sky, casting that soft golden light over everything. It was beautiful. I felt the familiar hum of the plane beneath me, and it was like I was home again. For the first time in a long while, I felt calm. Everything seemed normal at first. I was up there, just me and the clouds, enjoying the quiet. I had my radio off, my focus solely on the flight. The world seemed so small from up there, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was at peace. But that's when things started to change. I don't really know how to explain it. It started with a feeling, a strange sensation like I wasn't alone anymore. At first, I thought I was just imagining it. But then I saw something in the distance. It was a shape, just a little dot at first, but it was moving. I didn't think much of it. Planes aren't uncommon up there, but this didn't look right. It wasn't a commercial flight, and it wasn't a military jet either. This was something different. I couldn't make out the details at first, but it was big. Too big for anything I'd ever seen. And it was moving in a way that didn't make sense, like it was hovering rather than flying. I've been flying for years, and I've never seen anything behave like that. I couldn't take my eyes off it, but it wasn't until it got closer that I started to realize what I was looking at. I've been through all sorts of weather, navigated around thunderstorms, and dealt with equipment failures, but this felt wrong. I should have turned back right then. I should have flown away, but I didn't. I just kept staring at it, frozen in place, as it slowly got closer. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. It looked like it was made of something. I don't even know how to describe it. It was sleek, almost like glass, but glowing, shimmering in the light. I could see no seams, no rivets, nothing that would suggest it was built the way anything I've flown in was. There was no sound, no engine noise, just the soft hum of the air around me. It was like the thing wasn't even trying to be noticed, yet it was impossible not to see it. I tried to get a closer look, but I couldn't. It was too high, and I couldn't adjust my altitude fast enough. I was just floating there, watching it, trying to understand what it was. It didn't move like a plane or a helicopter. It seemed to just float there in the sky, hovering. And I don't know how long I was staring at it, but it felt like hours. It felt like time had stopped. At some point, I felt it. Something coming from the craft. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was more like a feeling, a presence. I can't explain it any better than that, but I knew it was trying to communicate with me. I don't know how. Maybe it was the vibrations in the air or something in my mind, but I knew it was trying to reach out. And then it happened. The craft shifted, and for a split second, I thought it was going to crash into me. But it didn't. Instead, the air around me seemed to ripple, and suddenly the craft was just there, right next to me, hovering in the air no more than a few hundred feet from my plane. I remember thinking I should have panicked. I should have done something, but I didn't. I felt calm, too calm, like something inside me told me this wasn't a threat. It was something else, something important. I don't know how long I just stared at it, but eventually something happened. The craft, it began to communicate. Not with words, but with images. It was like I was seeing a picture, like a slideshow, flashing before my eyes. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. It was flashes of scenes, strange landscapes, unfamiliar cities, and people that didn't look like anything I'd ever seen. Then, as the images kept coming, I started to understand. I could feel the emotions tied to them, fear, urgency, and then the images stopped. I was left with this overwhelming sense of warning. It was like the craft, like whatever was inside it, was trying to tell me something. A voice filled my head, not speaking to me directly, but still clear in my mind. You must share this. It wasn't in words, not really, but it was the message. You must share this. I remember my heart racing, my mind spinning. The urgency of it all hit me like a brick. But then, just as quickly, the feeling was gone. The craft drifted away, moving silently off into the distance. I didn't know what to do. My mind was flooded with everything I had seen, everything I had felt. I knew what it wanted, what it had shown me, but I didn't know if I was ready to share it. Who would believe me? Who could understand? How could I explain what I had just experienced? The craft didn't return. It just disappeared, fading into the sky like it had never been there at all. I kept flying, my mind still racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I don't know how long I kept going, but eventually I made my way back to the base. I landed the plane, but the ground felt too solid after what I'd seen up there. I couldn't stop thinking about the warning, about the future. For days, I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't even begin to explain it, but the message kept running through my head over and over. You must share this, and I still don't know if I should. What if I'm wrong? What if it was a mistake to keep quiet? What if telling someone puts us all in danger? Or worse, what if no one believes me at all? I don't know. But I can't forget what I saw. I can't forget the warning. And now, every time I look up at the sky, I wonder if they're watching, waiting to see what I'll do next. It started with a dream. I don't usually remember my dreams, but this one stayed with me. It was dark, and I was standing alone in an empty concert hall. No audience, no orchestra, just me and my violin. I wasn't holding it at first, but when I looked down, there it was, resting under my chin, bow in my hand. The music began on its own, like the hall itself was playing it. The notes were strange, high and fast, but not chaotic. It was like the melody wanted to say something, but I couldn't figure out what. My fingers moved without me thinking, trying to follow along, but the notes were impossible. I woke up sweating, my heart racing like I'd been running instead of sleeping. At first, I brushed it off as stress. I'd been practicing non-stop for an upcoming performance, so it made sense my brain was stuck on music. But then it happened again the next night. The same dark hall, the same impossible tune. This time I tried to focus harder to remember the notes. My fingers strained to mimic the melody, but no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't keep up. It was like the violin was mocking me. When I woke up, I grabbed a notebook from my nightstand and started scribbling down what I remembered. The notes didn't make sense. Sharp jumps, odd rhythms, key changes that seemed unnatural. I spent hours trying to play it the next morning, but I couldn't even get through the first few measures. The intervals were all wrong, and the tempo was inhuman. I felt like a failure. How could I be a professional violinist if I couldn't even play a piece from my own dream? The dreams kept coming every night for a week straight. Each time, the music got louder, more insistent. It wasn't just the melody anymore. I started hearing harmonies, layers of sound that made no sense together but somehow fit. It was overwhelming. I'd wake up exhausted, my head pounding like I'd been at a rock concert instead of sleeping. One night, I tried not to sleep at all. I stayed up practicing scales, drinking coffee, anything to keep my mind occupied. But around 3 a.m., my eyes got heavy, and before I knew it, I was back in the hall. This time, it was different. I wasn't alone. There was a figure standing in the shadows, tall and thin, almost skeletal. It didn't look human. Its skin was pale and shiny, like polished stone, and its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly blue. It didn't move or speak, but I could feel it watching me. The music started again, louder than ever, and this time, the figure raised a hand, like it was conducting. My bow arm moved on its own, jerking across the strings in a way that felt unnatural, painful even. I tried to stop, but I couldn't. My body wasn't mine anymore. The figure tilted its head, and the melody shifted, growing faster, more complex. I could feel the strings cutting into my fingers, the bow hairs fraying with the strain. When I woke up, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold a glass of water. I started to think I was losing my mind. I avoided my violin for days, too scared to touch it. But the dreams didn't stop. They got worse. The figure came closer each time, its blue eyes burning brighter. The music grew louder, almost deafening, and the pain in my hands followed me into the waking world. Then one night, everything changed. I woke up, but the music didn't stop. It was faint at first, like it was coming from another room. I thought I was still dreaming, but when I sat up, I could hear it clearly. The same impossible tune echoing through my apartment. I followed the sound, my heart pounding. It led me to my practice room, where my violin was propped up on its stand. The bow was resting across the strings, vibrating slightly, as if it had just been played. The air felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. I don't know what made me pick up the violin, but I did. As soon as it was in my hands, the music surged, filling my head like it was coming from inside me. My fingers moved on their own again, but this time, it felt different. The notes still didn't make sense, but I could play them. My body moved faster than it ever had before, faster than I thought possible. The melody flowed out of me like water, strange and beautiful and terrifying all at once. When the piece ended, the silence was deafening. I realized I wasn't alone. The figure from my dreams was standing in the corner, watching. It was real, more solid than I could have imagined. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The figure raised a hand, and I felt something in my mind, a presence, like it was speaking without words. I can't explain it, but I understood. The music wasn't just a melody, it was a message. They were trying to communicate, to share something with me, something important, their culture, their history, their existence. I don't know how long I stood there, but when the figure finally vanished, the weight lifted and I collapsed to the floor. The music was gone, but it left something behind, an imprint in my mind. I could still hear it if I concentrated, still feel the rhythm in my veins. That was months ago. I haven't had the dreams since, but the melody is still with me. I've started writing it down, trying to piece it together bit by bit. It's still impossible to play, at least not completely, but I'm getting closer. Sometimes, late at night, I feel like I'm being watched. I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye or hear a faint hum that reminds me of the music. I don't think they're gone, not really, but I don't feel afraid anymore. Whatever they were, they didn't want to hurt me. They just wanted to be heard. I was working the late shift at the pharmacy, as usual. Nights were usually quiet, just the regulars coming in for refills or the odd new face picking up something for a sick kid or a headache. It was easy work, though the silence sometimes got to me. I kept busy by organizing shelves or cleaning the counter for the 100th time. That night, though, I had no idea what I was about to get myself into. It started with a man walking in around 11:30 p.m. He looked normal enough at first. Tall, thin, wearing a gray coat that seemed too big for him. He had a prescription slip in his hand and a strange, blank look on his face. When he got to the counter, he didn't say much, just slid the paper over to me and stood there, staring. I read the slip. It was for something called xylonactin. I'd never heard of it before, and I'd been a pharmacist for over a decade. The dosage instructions were strange, too. It said, take 2 capsules every 2.5 hours, avoid exposure to sunlight for 17 hours post-dose. The prescribing doctor's name was scribbled, barely legible, and the clinic address didn't ring any bells. I felt a little uneasy. I don't think we carry this, I said, glancing up at him. He just nodded once, like he'd expected that. Then he said in a flat, monotone voice, can you order it? I'd need more information, I replied. Let me check our database. I turned to the computer, typing in the name of the drug. Nothing came up. Not a single hit. That was weird. Even experimental drugs usually had some kind of record. I told him as much, and he just nodded again. Okay, he said, and without another word, he turned and walked out. I chalked it up to some kind of prank or misunderstanding. Maybe he'd written the name wrong, or maybe it was one of those scam prescriptions you hear about sometimes. Either way, it wasn't worth losing sleep over. The next night, a woman came in. She had the same blank look, the same slow, deliberate movements. She handed me a prescription, and my stomach twisted when I saw it. It was for xylonactin, same dosage instructions, same barely legible doctor's name. Are you related to the man who came in last night? I asked. She tilted her head like she didn't understand the question. I don't know him, she said, but there was something off about the way she said it, like the words were rehearsed. I told her the same thing I told the man. We didn't have it, and I couldn't order it. She didn't argue, didn't even seem disappointed, just nodded and left. Over the next week, it happened 3 more times. Different people, same prescription. They all looked off somehow. Pale, like they'd never seen the sun, and their movements were stiff, unnatural. One of them came in wearing sunglasses at night. When I asked why, he said, light hurts my eyes. His voice was like the others, flat, lifeless. I started getting paranoid. I even called the clinic listed on the prescriptions, but the number didn't work. The address didn't exist on any map I checked. It was like these people were coming out of nowhere. One night I decided to confront one of them. A young woman came in, maybe early 20s, with the same prescription. I asked her point blank, what is this medication for? She stared at me for a long moment before answering, to prevent adaptation failure. What does that mean? She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and started to leave. I panicked. I wasn't about to let another one of these people slip away without answers. I called out, wait, and stepped around the counter, trying to stop her. She moved faster than I expected, almost inhumanly fast. Her hand shot out, grabbing my wrist, and her grip was ice cold. You should stop asking questions, she said, her voice still eerily calm. Then she let go and walked out, leaving me standing there, heart pounding. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what she'd said. Adaptation failure. What did that mean? And why did she seem so wrong? The next day, I did some digging. I looked up every name and address I could think of, trying to find some link between these people. Nothing added up. But then I noticed something. Every one of the patients had come from the same general area, a few miles out of town near an abandoned industrial park. I decided to check it out. It was a stupid idea, I know that now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on. So, the next evening after my shift, I drove out there. The place was creepy. Rusted fences, broken windows, and not a single sign of life. I parked a little ways away and walked in. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just empty buildings and overgrown weeds. But then I heard voices. Low, murmuring voices, coming from one of the warehouses. I crept closer, trying to stay quiet. Peeking through a broken window, I saw a group of people standing in a circle. They weren't talking, not exactly. They were making these strange clicking and hissing noises like insects. And in the middle of the circle was a large container, glowing faintly green. I couldn't see what was inside, but whatever it was, it made my skin crawl. One of them turned, and I swear their eyes glowed for a second, like an animal caught in headlights. That was enough for me. I ran back to my car and drove home, heart racing the whole way. I didn't go back to work after that. I called in sick, then quit the next week. I don't know what those people were or what they were doing, but I didn't want any part of it. I haven't seen any of them since. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear those clicking sounds outside my window. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I'm not so sure. All I know is I got out alive, and I'm not going back. It was 1962, during the height of the Cold War, when I found myself flying out of Ramstein Air Base. I was part of a 4-man squadron running reconnaissance missions over Europe. We were the eyes and ears of the Air Force, always on the lookout for anything unusual. Back then, tensions were so high you could feel them in the air, like static before a storm. We were on a routine patrol over West Germany, skimming along the edge of Soviet airspace. The plan was simple. Fly a loop, monitor radio frequencies, and gather intel. The weather was clear, the kind of cold, crisp night where the stars felt closer than the ground below. Everything was going as planned until we received a scrambled order to redirect. Vector east towards Sector 402, the voice said. No explanation, just coordinates. That wasn't unusual either. Orders came down the chain, and we followed them. We adjusted course, climbing higher to avoid radar. As we neared the new sector, I noticed a strange blip on my radar. It wasn't moving like a plane or a bird. It would dart, stop, then dart again, always staying just outside of what we could pinpoint. Anyone else seeing this? I radioed to the others. Yeah, came a reply from Captain Harris, our squadron leader. Could be a glitch. But it didn't feel like a glitch. It felt deliberate. We stayed in formation, scanning the skies and our instruments. About 5 minutes later, I spotted it with my own eyes. It was off our starboard side, maybe a mile out, glowing faintly in the dark. It wasn't a plane, that much was obvious. It was too round, like a flattened sphere, and it didn't have any lights, just a soft, shifting glow, like it was alive. What in God's name is that? Harris muttered over the radio. We didn't get much time to speculate. The object suddenly zipped toward us, closing the distance in a blink. It stopped so abruptly it defied every law of physics I knew. It hovered there, just off Harris's wing, perfectly silent and steady. Do not engage, Harris ordered, his voice tight. Hold formation. But then it moved again, almost playfully, circling our planes. It passed so close to me that I could see its surface, a smooth, seamless silver that reflected the moonlight like liquid mercury. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. Harris tried to communicate with it. He flashed his lights in a pattern, slow and steady, but it didn't respond. Instead, it shot straight up, disappearing into the night. We thought it was gone, but then it came back, this time directly in front of us. Break formation! Scatter! Harris barked. We split off, each of us diving and climbing in different directions. The object didn't chase one of us, it chased all of us. It would dart from one plane to another, faster than anything I'd ever seen, like it was studying us. Then my instruments went haywire. My altimeter spun wildly, the radio filled with static, and the stick in my hand felt sluggish, like I was fighting against something. I wasn't the only one. "I've lost control," one of the others shouted. "It's messing with the plane." My heart was in my throat. I thought for sure I was going to crash, but then everything just stopped. The object pulled back, hovering in the distance as if it had lost interest. "What now?" I asked, my voice shaking. "We stay put," Harris said. "Let it make the next move." It did. The glow around it intensified, and then it emitted a bright flash. I thought I was blind for a second, but when my vision cleared, the thing was gone. Just like that, it had vanished without a trace. We regrouped and returned to base in silence. None of us knew what to say. When we landed, we were immediately debriefed by a group of men I'd never seen before. They weren't Air Force, that much was clear. They took our flight logs, confiscated our helmets, and told us to forget what we saw. "National security," one of them said. "This incident did not happen." Harris argued with them, but it didn't matter. The next day, we were reassigned to separate squadrons. The official report said we encountered an unregistered Soviet aircraft, but I know what I saw. That wasn't anything made on this planet. To this day, I can't look up at the night sky without feeling like I'm being watched. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. And whoever covered it up knew a lot more than they were letting on. We got the call just after midnight. The higher-ups didn't give us much to go on, just coordinates in the middle of a desert and orders to secure the area. They used the term unidentified object, but the tone suggested more than a routine incident. I was part of a 5-man squadron, experienced enough to know when something wasn't right. The fact that they scrambled us so quickly and emphasized secrecy only confirmed it. The ride out was quiet. Our convoy rolled over uneven terrain, the hum of the engines the only sound cutting through the stillness. The desert stretched endlessly, a flat expanse under a black sky littered with stars. No moon, just the faint glow of the Milky Way above. It felt like we were driving into a void. When we got close to the coordinates, the first thing we noticed was the light. It wasn't natural. A soft bluish-white glow spilled over the horizon, too steady to be fire or anything man-made. It didn't flicker or pulse. It just hung there, casting long, faint shadows across the sand. We stopped a good half-mile from the source, dismounting to approach on foot. The air was colder than it should have been for the desert, and it carried an odd metallic taste. The light grew brighter as we got closer, but it wasn't blinding. It felt almost inviting, though none of us were stupid enough to lower our guard. The glow turned into shapes, structures, as we crested the last dune. What we saw stopped us in our tracks. It was a city, small but unmistakably a city. Buildings rose in strange, angular patterns, their edges sharp and clean. The walls seemed to shimmer, not solid but almost translucent, like they were made of light instead of matter. The entire city pulsed faintly, the glow running through the streets and up the sides of the structures as if the whole thing was alive. "Secure the perimeter," our leader, Sergeant Whitman, ordered. His voice was steady, but I could see his grip on his rifle tighten. We moved cautiously, splitting into pairs to circle the city. As we got closer, the details became clearer. The buildings didn't have windows or doors, just smooth surfaces that reflected the faint light. The streets were empty, perfectly smooth and curved in unnatural ways, looping and twisting like they followed some alien logic. "Looks like it's made of energy," Rodriguez, my partner, muttered. I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. Then we saw them. Figures moved within the city, dozens of them, maybe more. They weren't human. They had humanoid shapes, sure. 2 arms, 2 legs, but they were taller, thinner, and their heads were elongated, their movements too fluid. Like the buildings, they weren't solid. Their forms shimmered and flickered, as if they were made of the same light as the city. "They're not real," I said, though I wasn't sure. Rodriguez nodded, his face pale. We regrouped at the edge of the city. Whitman had us hold position while he radioed for instructions. That's when we realized our comms were dead. The radios didn't even crackle. It was like the entire area was a dead zone. "We stick together," Whitman said. "No one goes in alone." He didn't have to tell us twice. Whatever this place was, it wasn't normal, and none of us wanted to get separated. We moved as a unit, stepping cautiously into the city. The air felt heavier inside, pressing against my skin like an invisible weight. The streets were silent except for a faint hum, a low vibration that seemed to come from the structures themselves. The figures didn't react to us. They moved with purpose, walking in straight lines or gathering in open spaces, but they didn't acknowledge our presence. It was like we were invisible to them. Then we saw the first image, I guess you'd call it. It appeared on one of the walls as we passed, a three-dimensional projection that flickered to life like a hologram. It showed a scene from Earth, clear as day, a dense jungle with animals I couldn't name, all moving naturally, like a video. The image shifted, showing other scenes. A massive herd of elephants crossing a plain, a village with straw huts, a market filled with people trading goods. "What the hell is this?" Rodriguez whispered. "It's us," Whitman said, his voice tight. "It's our history." The projections were everywhere. Each building we passed showed a different scene, all of them familiar but strange. Some were ancient, like the pyramids being built, while others were modern, showing cities with skyscrapers and bustling streets. It wasn't just events, though. It was like the city was documenting everything: plants, animals, people, even weather patterns. It was like some kind of library, but not for books, for life. We stopped in the middle of what looked like a square. The projections here were larger, more detailed, showing battles and celebrations, disasters and discoveries. One wall displayed a war, soldiers clashing in brutal combat, their faces twisted in pain. Another showed a family sitting around a fire, their laughter frozen in time. "This isn't just history," Lopez said, breaking the silence. "It's everything." The figures were closer now, moving around us but still ignoring us. Up close, their features were clearer. They had no faces, just smooth surfaces where eyes and mouths should have been. Their bodies were made of the same shifting light as the city, their forms flickering like static on a screen. Then one of them stopped. It turned toward us, its head tilting slightly. The others kept moving, but this one stood still, staring, or at least, I thought it was staring. There were no eyes to confirm it, but I felt its attention like a weight on my chest. Whitman raised his rifle. "Stay back," he warned, though his voice wavered. The figure didn't move. Instead, the hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through my bones. The projections around us flickered, their images distorting. Then, in my head, I heard a voice. Not words exactly, but a feeling, an understanding. "Observe, learn, preserve." I staggered back, clutching my head. The others reacted the same way, wincing as if they'd been hit by a blast of sound. The figure tilted its head the other way, its light pulsing faster. "We need to leave," Whitman said, his voice sharp. "Now." We backed away, moving quickly but carefully, keeping our eyes on the figures. They didn't follow, but the hum grew louder with each step, almost unbearable. The projections blurred, their images collapsing into static. When we finally crossed the boundary of the city, the hum stopped. The air felt lighter, and the metallic taste was gone. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the convoy, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The city was still there, glowing faintly behind us, but none of us looked back. Whitman tried the radio again, and this time, it worked. We reported what we saw, but I don't think anyone believed us. The official report classified it as an unexplained phenomenon and buried it under layers of bureaucracy. I think about that city sometimes, about what it was doing out there in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't hostile, not really, but it wasn't friendly either. It was just there, watching, recording, preserving, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, glowing in the desert, documenting everything we do. It wasn't supposed to be a big expedition. Just a few of us who'd been caving for years, going to explore a system that had barely been mapped. It was deep in the mountains, far from any towns, a kind of place that felt untouched. We had a guide, local to the area, who told us the caves went on for miles. Some passages were tight, others opened into huge chambers, perfect for what we were looking for. The first day was uneventful. We descended through the main entrance, a wide gap in the rock face that sloped down into the earth. The air was cool, damp, and carried the smell of wet stone. There was nothing unusual about it. Stalactites, trickling water, the occasional bat. We marked our route, made notes, and set up camp in a dry chamber about 3 hours in. On the second day, we went deeper. The cave system branched off in several directions, and we decided to split into pairs to cover more ground. I went with Eric, a geologist who'd been on dozens of trips like this. He was methodical, always stopping to take samples and measurements, while I handled the mapping. We'd been exploring for a few hours when we found the chamber. At first, it didn't seem like anything special. The passage opened into a space about the size of a small house, with smooth walls and a ceiling that arched high above us. But then Eric pointed out something strange. The walls weren't entirely natural. There were grooves, evenly spaced, running in a spiral pattern from floor to ceiling. They looked carved, but not by tools, more like they'd been melted or shaped by something that didn't leave marks. In the center of the chamber was the artifact. That's the only word I can think of to describe it. It was about the size of a barrel, metallic and shaped like a cone with the tip broken off. The surface was covered in patterns that seemed to shift when you looked at them, as though they were alive. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light from our headlamps, but no, it was moving. Neither of us spoke for a while. We just stood there, staring at it. I don't know how long we stayed like that, but eventually, Eric broke the silence. He wanted to take a closer look, maybe even touch it. I wasn't so sure. Something about it made my skin crawl, like it didn't belong here, or anywhere for that matter. Eric didn't listen. He stepped closer and pulled out his tools, brushing away some of the dust and debris that had settled on the base. As he worked, a low hum started to fill the chamber. It wasn't loud, but it felt like it was vibrating in my chest. Eric froze, his hand hovering just above the surface of the artifact. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I nodded, but I didn't say anything. The hum was getting louder, and the air seemed heavier, like it was pressing down on us. That's when the artifact activated. I don't know how else to describe it. The hum turned into a deep, resonant sound that made the walls shake. Light started to pulse from the patterns on its surface, bright and sharp, like nothing I'd ever seen. Eric stumbled back, dropping his tools, and we both scrambled to the edge of the chamber. The sound grew louder, deeper, until it was almost unbearable. It wasn't just noise. It was energy. I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through me, making it hard to think. The walls of the chamber seemed to amplify it, focusing it into a single point above the artifact. Then, with a flash of blinding light, the sound stopped. The chamber was silent, the air still. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then we heard it, a low, distant rumble coming from somewhere far above us. The ground started to tremble, and bits of rock and dust fell from the ceiling. Eric grabbed my arm, yelling something I couldn't hear over the noise, and we ran. We made it back to the main passage just as the tremors subsided. I don't know how we managed to navigate the tunnels, but we eventually found the others. They were pale, shaken, and said they'd heard the sound too, even from the other side of the cave system. None of them had any idea what it was. We decided to leave. The artifact was too strange, too dangerous, and none of us wanted to stick around to see what would happen next. The hike back to the surface was tense, every sound and shadow making my heart race. When we finally emerged into the daylight, I felt a wave of relief until we saw the sky. There was something up there, just beyond the atmosphere. It looked like a faint ripple, like heat waves rising from pavement, but it moved with purpose. As we watched, it shifted and pulsed as though it were reacting to something. Then, with a final burst of light, it vanished. We didn't talk much on the way back to town. Eric and I tried to explain what we'd seen, but the others didn't want to hear it. By the time we reached civilization, it felt like we'd stepped back into a different world. The caves, the artifact, the light in the sky, it all seemed so far away. I don't know what the artifact was or why it reacted the way it did. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the sound it made, the way it seemed to call out, and I wonder if something somewhere heard it. I had been out in the field for 2 weeks by the time it happened. I was working on a project for my geology research, studying some rock formations in a remote area. It was a desolate place, just stretches of dry land and jagged outcrops, the kind of terrain where you don't see another person for miles. That was one of the reasons I chose it. Fewer distractions, fewer interruptions. Just me and the rocks. The site was in the middle of a desert. It wasn't anything too spectacular to look at, mostly sandstone formations with a few interesting basalt columns scattered here and there. But there were some anomalies in the region, unusual mineral compositions and erosion patterns that didn't fit the timeline of the surrounding landscape. That's what I was there to figure out. I had a small campsite set up near the edge of a dried riverbed. During the day, I'd hike out with my tools, take samples, and make notes. At night, I'd sit by the fire and go over my findings. The nights were quiet, just the sound of the wind and the occasional rustle of some desert animal. It was peaceful in a way, but also isolating. On the 13th day, I came across something strange. I was exploring a section of the formations I hadn't examined closely yet, a cluster of oddly shaped rocks that stood out from the rest. They were smoother than the surrounding stones, almost polished, and their color was different too, darker with a faint metallic sheen. At first, I thought they might have been shaped by wind erosion, but the symmetry was too perfect. It was like they'd been sculpted. I spent most of the afternoon studying them. I took measurements, made sketches, and chipped off a few small samples to analyze later. Something about them felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. They didn't seem natural, but I couldn't think of any other explanation. I figured I'd look into it more when I got back to the lab. That night, as I was reviewing my notes by the fire, I felt uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just a sense that something wasn't right. The air felt heavier, and the usual sounds of the desert seemed quieter. I tried to brush it off as fatigue. 2 weeks in the middle of nowhere can mess with your head. The next morning, I went back to the site. As I got closer, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The rocks had moved. I know how that sounds. Rocks don't move, but they weren't in the same position as the day before. One of the larger ones, a tall column-like shape, was now tilted at a different angle, and a smaller one had shifted several feet to the side. There were no signs of a landslide or disturbance in the ground. It was as if they'd just walked. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. Maybe I'd made a mistake, misremembered their positions. I went back to my notes and sketches from the day before, comparing them to what I was seeing. They didn't match. The rocks had definitely moved. I decided to set up a camera. I had a small trail cam in my gear, something I used occasionally to document erosion patterns over time. I mounted it on a tripod and aimed it at the cluster of rocks, setting it to take a photo every 10 minutes. Then, I went back to my camp, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint sounds outside my tent, like soft scraping or shifting, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. The wind had picked up, howling through the canyons, and the temperature had dropped sharply. I stayed up until the early hours, clutching my flashlight and listening to the sounds of the night. When I checked the camera the next morning, my heart nearly stopped. The photos showed the rocks moving. It wasn't subtle. In one frame, they were in their original positions. In the next, they were closer together, as if they were gathering. By the last frame, they had rearranged themselves into a perfect circle. It was impossible. There was no logical explanation for it. Rocks don't move on their own. They don't form patterns. But there it was, right in front of me. I decided to approach the site again, though every instinct was telling me to pack up and leave. As I got closer, I felt a strange vibration in the air, like a low hum just on the edge of hearing. The ground beneath my feet felt warmer, almost as if it were alive. When I reached the rocks, I stopped dead in my tracks. One of them was watching me. At least that's what it felt like. The tallest rock, the one I'd thought was just another formation, had a faint, glowing slit near the top. It wasn't a crack or a fissure, it was an eye, unblinking and alien, staring right at me. The hum grew louder, resonating in my chest, and I realized it wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming from the rocks. I don't remember dropping my tools, but I must have, because I found myself backing away with empty hands. The rocks began to shift again, slowly and deliberately, as if they were communicating with each other. The hum turned into a series of clicks and tones, rhythmic and purposeful. It was language, though not one I could understand. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. The rocks didn't move toward me, but they didn't retreat either. They just observed. I felt like an insect under a magnifying glass, small and insignificant. Eventually, I turned and ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I reached my campsite. I packed up as quickly as I could, throwing everything into my truck and speeding down the dirt road without a second thought. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally stopped to catch my breath. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. Not my colleagues, not my friends. I told myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the light, anything to make it seem less real. But deep down, I knew the truth. Those weren't rocks. They were something else, something alive, something watching. I haven't been back to that site since. I don't plan to. But sometimes late at night, I still hear that hum in my head, faint and distant, like a memory I can't quite forget. It all started when I went to the lake with a few friends for a weekend trip. We had all agreed on going to the park for a couple of days to get away from everything and just relax. It had been a while since I had been to that lake, but it was always one of my favorite places to go. The water was clear, the air was fresh, and the peacefulness of it all just made you forget about everything else. But that weekend, something changed. It was a Saturday afternoon when I first noticed it. We were lounging by the shore, soaking in the sun and chatting, when I saw it, a strange, soft glow coming from the lake. At first, I thought it was just the light reflecting off the water in a way I hadn't seen before. But as I looked more closely, I realized it wasn't the sunlight. It wasn't anything natural. The water had taken on this eerie, pale blue glow. It wasn't bright or flashy, but it was enough to catch your attention. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My friends started looking at it too. Jenna, one of my friends, stood up and pointed. "Is that normal?" she asked. None of us had ever seen anything like it. We didn't really think much of it at first. We all just assumed it was some kind of optical illusion or something. Maybe algae or minerals in the water were reacting to the sun in a strange way. After all, we were all familiar with this lake, and it never did anything like that before. But we weren't exactly experts on lakes or anything. After a few minutes of talking about it, we decided to just go for a swim. It wasn't too cold, and the glow was kind of mesmerizing. At least it didn't seem harmful, so we didn't think twice about it. I remember stepping into the water and feeling an immediate change in the atmosphere, but I couldn't quite place it. The air felt thicker, almost like the world around us was pressing in just a little more than usual. But at the same time, I felt oddly calm. The first thing I noticed was the way the water felt. It was warm. Not in the way the sun warms a pool, but in a way that almost seemed to come from within the water itself, like the lake was radiating heat, even though it wasn't hot outside. My body felt weightless as I swam. It wasn't a normal feeling. Normally, you'd feel the effort of swimming, the resistance of the water. But in that lake, it was as if the water was holding you up without trying. It felt too easy. I wasn't the only one who noticed this. Everyone else seemed to experience the same thing. We swam around, just floating, hardly moving, and the further we went into the water, the more intense the feeling became. It was like every muscle in my body was completely relaxed, but my mind was clear too. Like I was both awake and asleep at the same time. It was almost hypnotic. It was peaceful, but unsettling at the same time. At one point, I looked over at Jenna, who was floating beside me, and she looked like she was in a trance. She was just staring at the surface of the water, her eyes wide, almost too wide. "Are you okay?" I asked. But she didn't answer. She didn't even seem to hear me. I tried again, this time shaking her shoulder, but she just blinked slowly, like waking up from a dream. She turned to me, and her expression was blank, almost vacant. She didn't say anything, just nodded slowly, like she didn't know what had happened. I was starting to feel uneasy, but I couldn't shake off that strange, calm feeling. I looked around, and it seemed like all of us were acting the same way. We weren't swimming or playing around like we usually would. It was like we were all entranced, just floating in the lake, drifting without any care for time or the world outside. I tried to push the thought out of my head, but something told me that this wasn't right. That's when I noticed something else. The glow in the water wasn't just coming from the surface anymore. It was coming from beneath. The deeper parts of the lake were glowing brighter now, and I could see shapes moving beneath the surface, large shapes. The water around us seemed to hum, a low, vibrating sound that I felt deep in my chest. It wasn't loud, but it was there. It was almost like the lake itself was alive, breathing. "Do you guys hear that?" I asked, but no one responded. They were all still floating, staring at the water. I swam closer to the shore to try to get some distance from whatever was happening, but it felt like the water was pulling me back in. Every stroke I made seemed to take more effort, and the deeper I swam, the stronger the pull became. It was like they didn't want me to leave. That's when I saw it. Just beneath the surface, maybe 10 feet down, there was something large and round. It looked like a stone at first, but as I got closer, I saw that it wasn't. It was some kind of object, smooth and dark, with faint swirling patterns on its surface. It was glowing faintly, pulsing like it was alive. As I stared at it, I realized it was communicating somehow. Not through light or sound, but through the very water itself. I could feel it in my bones, in my head, a presence, like something was trying to speak to me. That's when I snapped out of it. It was like I suddenly realized what was happening. The calmness was gone, replaced by this overwhelming sense of dread. I needed to get out of the water. I didn't know what that thing was, but I knew it wasn't supposed to be there. I called to the others, but they didn't hear me. They were still floating, still staring at the surface of the lake. I swam back to them as fast as I could, but the pull from the lake was stronger now. It was almost like I was swimming through tar. My arms were heavy and my legs felt like lead. It took everything I had just to make it back to the shore. I pulled myself out of the water and turned to look back. That's when I saw it. Jenna was still in the water, but now she wasn't floating. She was sinking. Slowly, like the water was pulling her under. I screamed her name, but she didn't respond. She wasn't even moving. I had to do something. I didn't care if the lake was pulling me back in. I wasn't about to let her drown. I ran into the water, ignoring the strange heavy feeling in my chest. I grabbed her arm and pulled with all my strength, but it felt like I was trying to pull her out of quicksand. The water had a grip on her, pulling her deeper. I couldn't do it alone. I yelled for Mike and Ethan, and they finally snapped out of whatever trance they were in. They rushed over, and together, we pulled Jenna out of the water. As soon as she was on the shore, the pull stopped. The glow in the lake dimmed, and the humming sound faded. We all stood there, panting, looking at the water. The lake was still, peaceful again, but there was no denying what had just happened. We didn't know what that thing was or why it had tried to pull us under, but we knew we couldn't stay. We packed up as quickly as we could and left the lake behind. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. Maybe it was some kind of alien organism or maybe something else entirely. But I do know this: I'll never go near that lake again. We were out on a routine patrol, the kind you've done so many times you don't even think about it anymore. The briefing was simple: monitor the airspace, standard formation, nothing unusual. I was part of a fleet of 6 fighter jets, all flying in a tight pattern over open water. It was quiet, calm, the sky so clear you could see the curvature of the earth if you looked long enough. It was one of those days where everything felt easy. Then it didn't. I didn't notice anything at first. We were cruising at altitude, everyone keeping position, radios quiet except for the occasional check-in. I was scanning the sky, same as always, keeping an eye on my instruments, listening to the hum of the jet around me. But something changed. It was subtle at first, like the air got heavier or the light shifted in a way I couldn't explain. I thought it might have been my imagination, but then my instruments started to glitch. It wasn't dramatic at first, just little flickers on the radar screen, numbers on the altimeter shifting for no reason. I radioed the others to see if they were seeing the same thing, but the radio was dead. Just static. I tried switching frequencies, but nothing worked. I could see the other jets in formation, close enough to make out the pilots in their cockpits, but nobody could hear anyone. Then the power flickered. The HUD in my helmet went black for a second, then came back, but it was dimmer, weaker. My heart was pounding by then, but I kept it together, going through the emergency protocols in my head. I still had control of the jet. No engine trouble, no loss of maneuverability, but everything else was going haywire. It wasn't just me, either. The other jets started to break formation, each pilot trying to figure out what was happening on their own. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a glint of light, far off in the distance. It didn't look like anything I'd seen before, not a plane or a bird or even a drone. It was too bright, too precise, like a star that had decided to come closer. It was moving, but not like anything natural. It wasn't flying in a straight line or even a predictable curve. It was darting, stopping, starting like it was testing the air. Then it got closer. The light wasn't just a light. As it approached, I could make out a shape, rounded, smooth, like a drop of liquid metal suspended in the air. It didn't have wings or engines or anything that made sense for flight, but it was moving with purpose, like it was alive. It hovered there for a moment, close enough that I could see my reflection in its surface, distorted and rippling like I was looking into water. The jet controls locked up. I tried to adjust the throttle, the stick, anything, but nothing responded. The other jets were in the same situation, all of us drifting in the air like leaves on a still pond. The object moved between us, slow and deliberate, like it was examining each plane. My breath was caught in my throat. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't from here. One of the jets tried to fire. I could see the flash as the missile launched, but it didn't go anywhere. It just hung there in the air, frozen, like time itself had stopped around it. Then it dissolved. Not exploded. Dissolved. It was like the missile melted into nothing, particle by particle, until there was nothing left but a faint wisp of smoke. The object responded then. Not with weapons, not with force, but with light. A beam shot out from its surface, not aimed at any of us, but into the sky above. It wasn't a weapon, I knew that immediately. It was more like a signal, a message written in patterns of light and color that shifted and danced in ways I couldn't understand but couldn't stop watching. I didn't know what to do. None of us did. We were trained for combat, for emergencies, for survival, but this was beyond any of that. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't hostile, at least not yet. It could have destroyed us easily, but it didn't. It was waiting. I thought about the emergency flares we carried, the simplest form of communication we had. It was a long shot, but it was the only idea I had. I managed to get the manual controls for the flare system to work, one of the few things not locked up, and launched a single flare into the sky. The object reacted immediately. The light it emitted changed, shifting to match the color of the flare. Then it moved, slow and deliberate, positioning itself directly in front of my jet. I couldn't breathe. It was so close I felt like I could reach out and touch it. The lights on the object began to pulse, not randomly but in a pattern. I didn't understand it, but it felt intentional, like it was speaking in a language I couldn't hear but could see. I launched another flare, this time a different color. The object responded again, matching the color, pulsing faster. It was communicating. I didn't know what I was saying, but it was listening. We went back and forth like that, flare after flare, each one answered by the object. It didn't make sense, not logically, but I could feel something in the patterns, a rhythm, an understanding forming. It wasn't just light, it was thought, intent. It was alive. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The object shot straight up into the sky, faster than anything I've ever seen, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air where it had been. The controls on the jets came back, the radios crackled to life, and we were left sitting there in stunned silence. We returned to base, filed our reports, went through the debriefing. None of us could explain what had happened, and none of us were sure we wanted to. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, but it wasn't a threat either. It could have destroyed us, but it didn't. It wanted something else, something we couldn't fully understand. I think about it every day. The way it moved, the way it communicated, the way it felt like it was trying to tell us something. I don't know if it'll come back, but if it does, I hope we'll be ready to listen. I was in the forest on a photography trip when it happened. I don't like cities much, and being out in the woods away from the noise was something I always looked forward to. I had my camera gear with me, hoping to get some good shots of the wildlife. The area I was in was pretty remote, a national forest about 2 hours from the nearest town. I'd been there a few times before and always saw plenty of deer, birds, and the occasional fox. It was early afternoon when I first noticed something odd. I had been following a narrow trail for a while, moving slowly and keeping an eye out for anything worth photographing. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. Usually you could hear birds singing or squirrels rustling in the trees, but there wasn't much of that now. Just the sound of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional creak of the trees in the wind. I rounded a bend in the trail and saw a herd of deer up ahead, maybe a dozen of them. They were standing in a small clearing, just past a dense line of pines. At first, I was excited. I'd been hoping to find some deer to photograph, but as I got closer, I realized something wasn't right. They weren't moving. Not grazing, not walking, not even twitching their ears. They were all standing perfectly still, facing the same direction, like statues. I crouched down behind a bush and pulled out my camera, adjusting the zoom to get a better look. Through the lens, I could see their faces more clearly. Their eyes were wide, not in a normal way, but in a way that made my stomach knot up. They looked scared, or maybe entranced. All of them were staring at the same spot, deep in the forest. I followed their gaze, but I couldn't see what they were looking at. Just trees and shadows. I watched them for a while, waiting for them to move, but they didn't. It was like they were frozen. Even the wind didn't seem to touch them. Their fur didn't ruffle, and their tails didn't flick. It was unnerving. After a while, I decided to investigate. I left my camera on the ground and slowly walked toward the clearing. The closer I got, the more I felt something strange in the air. It wasn't cold exactly, but the air felt heavier, like the pressure before a storm. My skin started to tingle, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. When I stepped into the clearing, the deer didn't react. They didn't even seem to notice me. I could have walked right up to them and touched one, and I don't think they would have moved. But I didn't try. Something about the way they stood there made me nervous. Instead, I kept going, following the direction they were looking. The trees got denser as I moved further in, and the light filtered through the branches in strange patterns. The tingling sensation got stronger. I started to hear a faint sound, like a low hum, coming from up ahead. It was barely audible at first, but it got louder the closer I got. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't a machine, and it wasn't natural. It had a rhythm to it, but it didn't match any sound I could recognize. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. There was a glow coming from between the trees, soft and faint, like moonlight, but wrong for the time of day. As I got closer, I saw the source of the light. It was a sphere, about the size of a beach ball, hovering a few feet off the ground. It wasn't solid, at least not in the way I understood solid. The surface seemed to ripple and shift like liquid metal, but it didn't drip or flow. The glow wasn't steady either. It pulsed, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that seemed deliberate. I froze, unsure of what to do. The hum was louder now, resonating in my chest. It felt almost like music, but it wasn't music. It was something else entirely. The sphere didn't move, but I got the sense it was aware of me. That sounds crazy, but that's the only way I can describe it. It felt like it was watching me, even though it didn't have eyes. Then I noticed the animals. The deer weren't the only ones there. Birds were perched silently on the branches above, their heads turned toward the sphere. A fox was crouched low to the ground nearby, its body tense but unmoving. Even a pair of raccoons sat still, staring at the same spot. None of them reacted to me. They were all fixated on the sphere, like they were in some kind of trance. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. Time felt different. The sphere pulsed, and the hum seemed to change, shifting in tone and intensity. It wasn't random. It felt like it was trying to communicate, but I couldn't understand what it was saying. I started to feel lightheaded, like I was standing too close to something I wasn't supposed to be near. Finally, I backed away. Slowly at first, then faster as the hum grew louder. The animals didn't follow me. They didn't even seem to notice I was leaving. I ran back to the clearing where the deer had been, but they were gone. The whole forest felt different, like the air was lighter now, but the sense of unease stayed with me. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I drove away as fast as I could, not looking back. I haven't been back to that forest since. I don't know what I saw, and I'm not sure I want to know. But sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear that hum, faint and distant, like a memory I can't shake. I used to work in the Air Force as a radar operator. It wasn't a glamorous job like being a pilot or anything, but I liked it. It was steady, and you got used to the hum of the equipment and the endless green blips on the screen. Most nights were uneventful. I'd sit in my little room, drink bad coffee, and watch for anything unusual, though nothing ever was. This night started like any other. The clock said 10:47 p.m. when I noticed something strange on my radar. At first, I thought it was just a glitch. Sometimes the equipment acts up, you know? But this was different. It wasn't a random blip or static. It was a solid contact, and it was moving fast, way faster than anything we had or anything I knew could fly. The speed was the first thing that didn't make sense. I called over one of the other guys, Harris. He's been doing this longer than me, and I thought he'd explain it away, but he didn't. He just stared at the screen and then had his mouth tightening like he was trying to figure out a puzzle he didn't like. "That's not right," he said finally. "What do you mean?" I asked. "It's jumping," he said, pointing at the screen. And he was right. 1 second the object would be in one place, and then it'd blink out and show up somewhere else entirely. Not a smooth movement, but like it was skipping chunks of space in between. That's not how anything flies. Not planes, not drones, not missiles. Nothing. We logged it and called it in, and soon the room wasn't quiet anymore. People came in, higher-ups with serious faces, all asking the same thing. What's its heading? What altitude? How fast? And the thing is, we couldn't give them clear answers. The numbers didn't make sense. 1 second, it was moving at speeds that should have melted it into the atmosphere, and the next, it was practically hovering. Then it would disappear entirely for a few seconds before showing up miles away. They scrambled a jet to intercept it. I watched the radar as the pilot got closer. The object was still jumping around, but it seemed like it was letting the jet catch up, like it wanted us to see it. Then, as soon as the pilot got within visual range, the thing vanished off my screen entirely. I thought it was gone for good. But then the pilot came over the radio. His voice was shaky, and I could hear his breathing. "It's here," he said. "It's right in front of me." We all listened. The room was dead silent except for his voice. It's like nothing I've ever seen. It's shimmering. Like it's not solid. Like it's there and not there at the same time. Then he yelled something I couldn't make out, and his signal went dead. His jet showed up on the radar again, flying erratically. He was heading back to base, and when he landed, they rushed him out of the cockpit like he was sick or something. I never got to talk to him after that. The object came back a few minutes later. It was over the base this time, just sitting there, stationary on the radar. Everyone was on edge. You could feel it, this tight, electric kind of tension in the air. Someone asked if they should scramble more jets, but the commander said no. He was watching the screen, his jaw clenched. "Let's see what it does," he said. What it did was terrifying. It started flickering again, disappearing and reappearing, but now it was closer every time. First, it was a mile out, then half a mile, then right over the base, and then every screen in the room went black. Just like that. No warning. The lights stayed on, but all the equipment was dead. I remember just sitting there staring at my blank screen, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. Harris was muttering under his breath, "This isn't right. This isn't right. This isn't right." Then there was this sound. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't loud exactly, but it was wrong. Like metal bending and glass shattering, but deeper, slower, like it was underwater. It felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The power came back after what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. The object was gone. No trace of it on the radar. Nothing in the sky. Just gone, like it had never been there. They told us not to talk about it. Officially, it was a radar malfunction. That's what they wrote in the logs, and that's what we were told to say if anyone asked. But we all knew what we saw. We all felt it. I transferred out a few months later. I told myself it was just time for a change. But the truth is, I didn't want to be there if it came back. I didn't want to be sitting in that room, staring at that screen, waiting for something I couldn't explain or fight. I still think about it, though, especially at night. I'll be lying in bed and I'll hear a plane fly over, and for a split second I'll wonder if it's them. Whatever they were, whatever it was, I'll never forget the sound, that deep, wrong sound. Sometimes I hear it in my dreams, and every time I wake up thinking, what if it wasn't the last time? I didn't plan to be out that night. It was a spur-of-the-moment thing, grabbing my telescope and heading to the park. I guess I just needed a break from everything, some time to myself under the stars. The weather was clear, and the air felt cool enough to make it comfortable. The park wasn't far from where I lived, just a short walk, so I didn't bother telling anyone where I was going. I figured I'd only be gone a couple of hours. The park wasn't busy at night, which was perfect for me. A few streetlights lined the main path, but beyond that, it was mostly dark. There's a hill at the far end of the park that gives you a decent view of the sky, so that's where I set up. I carried my telescope in its case and brought a small backpack with a notebook, a flashlight, and some snacks. The hill was quiet, just me and the crickets chirping. I could hear the faint hum of cars in the distance, but it didn't bother me. I set up my telescope and pointed it toward the eastern sky. It wasn't anything special, just a mid-range model I'd picked up a few years ago, but it worked well enough for stargazing. I started with the usual things, bright stars, constellations, a few planets I could identify. It was relaxing, just sitting there looking up at the vastness of space. After a while, I noticed something odd. There was a cluster of stars near the horizon that didn't look right. They weren't part of any constellation I knew, and their arrangement seemed too perfect, like they'd been placed there on purpose. At first, I thought it might be some kind of optical illusion, or maybe my telescope was out of alignment. I adjusted the lens, checked the focus, but the pattern didn't change. The stars were arranged in a grid-like formation with equal spacing between them. It wasn't natural. I couldn't explain it, but something about it felt off. I sat there for a long time, staring at the pattern, trying to make sense of it. Then I noticed something else. The stars were blinking, not in the way stars normally twinkle. This was different. They were blinking in a sequence, one after the other, like they were following a rhythm. I grabbed my notebook and started writing down the pattern. At first, it didn't make any sense, just a series of dots and dashes like Morse code. But the more I looked at it, the more I felt like it was deliberate, like someone or something was trying to communicate. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a computer with me, and my phone was back at home. I thought about going back to get it, but I was afraid the pattern might change or disappear if I left. So I stayed there, staring through the telescope, writing down every blink, every sequence. Hours passed, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Around midnight, the blinking changed. The pattern slowed down, becoming more regular, almost like it was waiting for a response. I don't know why, but I felt like it was watching me, like it knew I was there. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I shined my flashlight around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing. Just the empty park and the sound of the wind in the trees. I turned back to the telescope and adjusted the focus again. That's when I saw it. It wasn't just stars. There was something else, something faint but unmistakable, just beyond the grid. It looked like a shape, dark and massive, blocking out part of the sky. It wasn't a cloud or a shadow. It was solid, and it was moving, slowly but deliberately. My hands were shaking as I tried to keep the telescope steady. The object was huge, bigger than anything I had ever seen. It looked like a ship, but not like any ship I could imagine. Its surface was smooth, almost reflective, and it had no visible lights or markings. It just hovered there, silent and ominous, on the edge of the atmosphere. The blinking stars, if they were stars, seemed to be coming from the ship. They weren't part of the sky at all. They were part of it. I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. I thought about packing up and running home, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. Then the blinking started again, faster this time. The grid shifted, and the lights formed a new pattern. It took me a moment to realize what it was. They were letters, English letters. I could hardly believe it, but there it was, spelled out in the sky. Help. I froze. My mind was racing. Help? Help with what? Who or what needed help? I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to yell, to scream into the night, but I knew that wouldn't accomplish anything. Instead, I grabbed my notebook and started writing down the letters as they appeared. The message kept coming, one word at a time. Danger. Trapped. Escape. I couldn't make sense of it, but the urgency was clear. Whatever was out there, it was in trouble, and it was reaching out to me. I felt a strange mix of fear and responsibility, like I'd been chosen for something I didn't understand. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the blinking stopped. The grid of lights faded, and the massive ship began to move. It didn't accelerate or make any noise. It just drifted away, disappearing into the darkness like a shadow melting into the night. I stared after it, my heart pounding, until the sky was empty again. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what I'd seen. The message, the ship, the lights. It all felt like a dream, but the notes in my hand were proof it wasn't. I packed up my telescope and walked home in a daze, replaying the events over and over in my mind. I still don't know what it meant or why it chose me. I've gone back to the park a few times since then, hoping to see the lights again, but the sky has been normal. Just stars and constellations, nothing unusual. I've thought about telling someone, scientists, authorities, anyone, but I don't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. All I have are my notes and the memory of that night. I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a random encounter. It felt deliberate, like a warning or a plea for help. Whatever it was, it's out there somewhere, and I can't stop wondering if it will come back. We were running a standard recon mission, something that wasn't supposed to be more than a few hours in the air. There had been reports of unusual radar signatures over the Bermuda Triangle. Civilian pilots claimed they saw strange lights or experienced sudden equipment failures. Usually that sort of thing turned out to be weather anomalies or malfunctioning instruments. But Command wanted answers, and we were sent to get them. There were 5 of us, each flying our own F-16. Captain Daniels led the squadron. I was second in command. The others, Carter, Lopez, and Singh, were solid pilots, reliable and sharp. We were all joking over comms during the first leg, treating it like just another patrol. The weather was clear, and the sky stretched out endlessly. The ocean below looked calm, almost too calm, like a giant sheet of glass. We were about an hour into the flight when the first anomaly hit. My instruments started acting up, not completely failing, but the altimeter and compass flickered like they couldn't decide on a reading. I glanced around and saw Carter's jet veering slightly to the left, his wing dipping. He came over the comms, saying his controls felt sluggish. "Stay in formation," Daniels ordered, his voice steady. "Switch to manual if you have to." Before anyone could respond, a strange light appeared directly ahead. It wasn't a normal light, not a flare or a reflection. It was bright but diffused, like a glowing mist, pulsing in and out. It didn't seem to have a source. It just hovered there in the air, growing brighter as we approached. Singh was the first to voice what we were all thinking. Is that moving toward us? The light wasn't stationary. It grew larger, spreading across the horizon as if it was swallowing the sky. Our radios cut out completely, replaced by a low hum that vibrated in my skull. My jet's controls locked up entirely, no response from the stick or pedals. I tried to pull back, but it was like the jet was caught in something, being pulled forward against my will. "Eject if you can," Daniels yelled, his voice distorted over the failing comms. I reached for the ejection lever, but before I could pull it, the light enveloped everything. It wasn't blinding, just overwhelming. The world outside the cockpit dissolved, replaced by an endless white void. My stomach churned as if the jet was spinning, though the instruments no longer worked to confirm it. Then it all stopped. When the light faded, I wasn't in the sky anymore. The jet wasn't flying. It was resting on solid ground, or something like ground. My cockpit canopy had gone dark, the controls completely dead. I reached for the emergency release, bracing myself for the worst, and the canopy popped open with a hiss. Cool air rushed in, smelling metallic and unfamiliar. I climbed out and froze. The landscape around me was nothing like Earth. The ground was a dull, grayish-green, smooth but uneven, like polished stone. Towering structures rose in the distance, geometric and jagged, glowing faintly with the same pulsing light we'd seen in the sky. The sky itself was a deep, swirling purple, with two massive moons hanging low, casting an eerie light over everything. The other jets were nearby, scattered in a rough circle. Daniels was already out of his cockpit, waving us over. One by one, we regrouped, silent and tense. No one knew what to say. Carter kept looking at the sky like he expected it to collapse on us. Singh muttered something about alien abductions, but no one answered him. "Everyone okay?" Daniels asked. We all nodded, though I could tell none of us felt okay. Before we could start assessing the situation, a sound broke the silence. A deep, resonating hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't mechanical. It felt alive, like a heartbeat amplified 1,000 times. We turned toward the source and saw them. They weren't human. That much was obvious. There were 5 of them, roughly our size but elongated, their limbs too long and their movements unnaturally fluid. Their skin was a pale, translucent blue, and their faces were featureless except for faint, glowing lines where eyes and mouths might have been. They didn't walk, they glided, their feet barely touching the ground. We instinctively raised our sidearms, though it felt useless. Daniels held up a hand, signaling us to stand down. The beings stopped a few yards away, observing us. One of them stepped forward, its glowing lines shifting into patterns that seemed almost like symbols. Then I heard a voice. Not out loud, but in my head. "Why do you come here?" It wasn't English, not exactly. The words didn't sound like anything, but I understood them. I could see from the others' faces that they heard it too. Daniel stepped forward, lowering his weapon. "We didn't mean to come here," he said, his voice steady. "We were pulled in by the light." The being tilted its head, as if considering his words. "You are not prepared for this place," it said. "Your existence disrupts the balance." "We want to go back," Daniel said firmly. "We mean no harm." The beings exchanged a series of patterns among themselves, their glowing lines pulsing faster. The hum in the air grew louder, making it hard to think. Then the one in front spoke again. "Return is possible, but not without cost. You must restore what you have taken." Daniels frowned. "What did we take?" The being didn't answer directly. Instead, it raised a hand, and the ground beneath us began to shift. A pool of light appeared, swirling with colors that hurt my eyes to look at. Images flickered within it, our jets, the energy they emitted, the disturbance they caused as they passed through the light. I realized then that our presence here had destabilized something. We weren't just intruders. We were a threat. Daniels looked back at us, his face grim. "We need to power down the jets," he said. "All systems completely off. They're feeding off our energy." We moved quickly, climbing back into the cockpits and shutting down every system. The jets had already been dead, but we made sure nothing was drawing power. When we regrouped, the beings seemed calmer. Their glowing lines softened and the hum faded slightly. "You may leave," the leader said, "but know this. Your world is fragile. Its boundaries are not secure. Take care where you tread." Before we could respond, the light returned, swallowing everything once more. When it faded, we were back in the sky, our jets functional again. The instruments showed we were right where we'd been before the anomaly, as if no time had passed at all. We returned to base in silence, each of us trying to process what had happened. The official report didn't mention aliens or other worlds. It called the incident a spatial anomaly and classified it as top secret. But I know what we saw, what we experienced. I still hear the hum sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet. It's faint, but it's there. And I can't help but wonder if we truly left that place, or if some part of it stayed with us. It was a routine patrol flight. I had done the pre-flight checks, fueled up, and taken off like I had hundreds of times before. The sky was clear that day, the kind of crisp blue that made flying feel effortless. The jet was responsive, every switch and lever behaving exactly how it should. It was quiet on the radio, and I was cruising at around 30,000 feet when the first strange thing happened. The cockpit lights flickered. Just a quick blip, like a power surge, but it was enough to make me pause. I checked the gauges. Everything looked normal, fuel, hydraulics, altitude, but then it happened again, longer this time. The entire dashboard blinked out for a few seconds before coming back on. I radioed the base, asking if there were any known issues with the electrical systems. No response. I tried again, switching frequencies, but the line stayed dead. It was unnerving, but I told myself it could have been interference or equipment failure. The jet was experimental, after all. As I adjusted my course, something caught my eye in the distance. It looked like a reflection at first, a glint of light far ahead. I thought maybe it was another aircraft, but there weren't supposed to be any in my area. The object wasn't moving like a plane or a drone. It hovered, completely still, even as I got closer. The flickering in the cockpit started again. Worse this time. The jet's engine sputtered briefly, and I could feel the controls becoming sluggish. Panic crept in as I tried to stabilize, but the jet was losing power. I pushed the throttle, but nothing happened. That's when I saw it clearly. The object wasn't metallic like I'd expected. It had this dark, almost translucent surface that seemed to ripple like oil on water. It wasn't solid, but wasn't entirely fluid either. It hovered a few hundred meters ahead, completely silent. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The jet was slowing down, dropping altitude fast. I checked every system, but it was like the power was being sucked out of the aircraft. Even the emergency backup refused to kick in. I pulled the ejection lever out of instinct, but it didn't respond. I was trapped, gliding helplessly toward the object. My breathing was sharp, my hands gripping the controls even though they were useless. As I got closer, the air around the cockpit felt different. Heavy, like the pressure was changing. My ears popped and I felt a deep vibration in my chest, not from the jet, but from the object itself. The jet stopped. Just stopped, mid-air, like it had hit an invisible wall. The object moved toward me, slow but deliberate, and then everything went dark. When I came to, I was still in the cockpit, but it wasn't in the sky anymore. The surroundings were black, an empty void that felt endless. My first thought was that I had crashed and was hallucinating, but the jet was upright, completely intact, and I wasn't hurt. Then the light started. It wasn't a normal light. It came from everywhere at once, soft but blinding in a way. Shapes began to form around me, shadows that moved without a clear source. The object from before was above me now, close enough that I could see the strange patterns shifting across its surface. It pulsed faintly, like it was breathing. Suddenly, a low hum filled the cockpit. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but felt in my body. My skin tingled, and my chest tightened. The controls lit up briefly before going dark again. The hum grew louder, and the jet began to shake. I thought this was it, that whatever this thing was, it was going to crush me or rip the jet apart. But then the shaking stopped. The hum changed, becoming rhythmic, almost like a signal. I realized it was scanning me, not just the jet, but me specifically. The patterns on its surface shifted faster, and I could feel something pulling at me. Not physically, but mentally. It was like it was trying to extract something from my thoughts, pulling memories and images I didn't even realize I was thinking about. I tried to fight it, to block it out, but it was overwhelming. I couldn't tell what it wanted, only that it was taking everything. Then the cockpit filled with light again, so bright that I had to shut my eyes. When I opened them, the void was gone. The jet was back in the sky, engine roaring like nothing had happened. The gauges were normal, the controls responsive, and the radio was active again. I called the base, and this time, they answered. They asked why I had gone off course, why I hadn't responded to their calls. I didn't know what to say. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. I told them I'd had a systems failure and made my way back to base. When I landed, the ground crew swarmed the jet, checking every inch for damage. They didn't find anything, not even a scratch. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt. I've tried to convince myself it was a malfunction, a hallucination, something explainable. But deep down, I know it wasn't. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't from here, and it's still out there, watching. It started as a routine trip, nothing special. I was working in a remote reserve, deep in a forest that felt like it had been untouched for centuries. My job was straightforward: catalog species, take soil samples, and make notes on the health of the ecosystem. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved the solitude. The forest felt alive in a way most places didn't anymore. The tree caught my attention because of its size. It was enormous, easily the oldest thing in the area. Its trunk was wide enough to fit a small car, and the bark was thick and gnarled, covered in moss and fungi. The roots spread out like a massive network, some disappearing into the soil while others twisted above ground like thick, muscular veins. I'd seen old trees before, but this one felt different. It had a presence, like it was watching everything around it. I was setting up my equipment near the tree when I felt it, a faint vibration under my feet. At first, I thought it was something normal, maybe the wind shifting the branches or animals moving underground. But the air was still and the vibrations weren't random. They had a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat, soft but steady. I crouched down, pressing my palm to one of the exposed roots. The vibration was stronger there, and it wasn't just a single pulse. It felt layered, like there were multiple rhythms overlapping. I'd never felt anything like it. I tried to tell myself it was probably some natural phenomenon, maybe water moving through the ground or seismic activity, but it didn't sit right. I spent hours around that tree, trying to figure it out. I took soil samples, recorded the vibrations with my phone, even used a basic seismometer I'd brought along. The readings were strange. The patterns didn't match anything geological, and they didn't seem to come from the tree itself. It was like they were coming from deep below it, far beneath the roots. I decided to dig. I didn't have proper tools for a deep excavation, just a small trowel in my hands. The soil was dense and packed with roots, making it slow work. As I dug, the vibrations grew stronger, enough to make my fingers tingle. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was uncovering something I wasn't supposed to find. About a foot down, I hit something solid. It wasn't a rock. The surface was smooth and cold, metallic, but not like any metal I'd seen before. It had a faint sheen, almost like it was glowing, though there was no light source. I cleared more soil away, revealing a rounded surface that curved downward into the earth. It was big, far bigger than I could uncover on my own. I sat back, staring at it. My chest felt tight, like I was holding my breath without meaning to. The vibrations were constant now, thrumming through the metal and into my body. It felt alive, not like an organism, but like a machine that was aware of me. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't stop myself. I pressed my palm to the surface, and everything went still. The forest was silent. No wind, no birds, not even the rustling of leaves. It was like the world had paused. Then, I felt it. Not a vibration, but a sensation, like something brushing against my mind. It wasn't words or images, just an overwhelming sense of being observed. I pulled my hand back, heart pounding, but the feeling didn't go away. I backed away from the tree, unsure of what to do. My first instinct was to leave, but the logical part of me said I needed to document this. I set up my camera, pointing it at the hole I dug, and started recording. As I spoke into the microphone describing what I'd found, the vibrations changed. They grew faster, more intense, and the ground beneath me started to hum. Then the tree reacted. The roots shifted, creaking like old wood under strain. One of the massive roots lifted slightly, exposing more of the metallic surface. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, like the tree was working with the thing buried beneath it. I froze, watching as the exposed surface began to glow faintly, pulsing in time with the vibrations. I don't know what made me stay, but I couldn't move. The glow intensified, spreading across the ground in a web of light. It was beautiful and terrifying, like watching something far beyond human understanding. I felt that presence again, stronger this time, and it was no longer just observing. It was trying to communicate. The vibrations became patterns, and I realized they were sending a message. It wasn't in any language I knew, but it had structure, like a code. I grabbed my notebook, frantically trying to record the sequences. As I wrote, I felt a strange clarity, like my thoughts were being guided. The message wasn't just sounds, it was ideas, concepts, something I could almost understand but not quite. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The glow faded, the vibrations ceased, and the forest came back to life. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the tree was just a tree again. The metal surface was still there, but it felt inert, like whatever had been active was now dormant. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, going over the patterns I'd recorded, trying to make sense of them. They didn't match any known code or language, but they felt deliberate, intelligent. I thought about the tree, how it had moved, how it seemed connected to whatever was buried beneath it. It wasn't just a plant. It was part of something much bigger. In the morning, I packed up my gear and left. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Part of me knew they wouldn't believe me, but the bigger part didn't want anyone else to disturb it. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't meant for us. It was old, older than the forest, maybe older than humanity, and it was still watching. I had been tracking the flock for over a week. The species was rare, some kind of migratory bird that only passed through the region once a year. I had seen them once before, years back, but never in numbers like this. They had settled in a remote area of the reserve, miles from any roads or trails. It took me 2 days just to hike out there, carrying my gear and a small tent. The birds were easy to spot. Their feathers caught the sunlight in a way that made them almost shimmer, and their calls were sharp and high, like nothing else I'd ever heard. I'd set up camp near the edge of a clearing where they roosted. Every morning, I watched them take off in a synchronized burst, hundreds of them moving together like a single organism. It was mesmerizing. That morning was no different at first. The air was cool, the sky a pale gray, and the forest around me was still waking up. I had my binoculars ready, scanning the trees, waiting for the flock to stir. When they did, it was sudden, like a switch had been flipped. One moment, they were still. The next, they were airborne, rising in a massive, twisting spiral above the clearing. I was about to grab my camera when I noticed something strange. The birds weren't moving the way they usually did. Instead of spreading out and heading toward the river, they were climbing higher and higher into the sky, circling tighter and tighter, like they were being pulled toward something. At first, I thought it was just an odd behavior, maybe a predator nearby. But then I saw it. The object was hovering just above the treetops, so still it almost blended into the clouds. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small car, but it didn't look like anything I'd ever seen. It was smooth and featureless, a dull metallic gray that seemed to shift slightly when I tried to focus on it. There were no lights, no sound, nothing to indicate how it was staying in the air. It was just there, motionless, as if it had always been part of the sky. The birds were drawn to it. One by one, they broke from the spiral and flew straight toward the object. I watched through my binoculars as they disappeared into its surface, vanishing without a trace. There was no impact, no reaction from the object. It was like they were being absorbed. The sight made my stomach churn, but I couldn't look away. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of natural phenomenon, maybe an atmospheric mirage or a strange cloud formation, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was nothing natural about the way the birds moved or the way the object seemed to pulse faintly, like it was alive. I didn't know what to do. I thought about running, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I thought about grabbing my camera, but the idea of moving, of drawing attention to myself, felt wrong. So I just stood there, frozen, watching as the last of the flock disappeared into the object. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the object began to rise. It moved so smoothly, so effortlessly that it didn't seem real. It climbed higher and higher until it was nothing more than a speck in the sky. And then it was gone, swallowed by the clouds. The forest was silent. The birds were gone, and with them, the usual sounds of the morning. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. I stood there for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I packed up my gear and started the long hike back to the ranger station. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I was safely inside. I thought about reporting what I'd seen, but what would I say? That a flock of rare birds had been taken by a hovering, silent craft? No one would believe me. They'd think I was crazy, or worse, lying. I haven't been back to that part of the reserve since. The thought of it makes my skin crawl. Sometimes late at night, I can still hear the birds' sharp, high calls in my mind, and sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, wherever that thing took them. We had just launched from the Cape, a routine deployment mission. Our shuttle was carrying 2 satellites, both designed to improve surveillance capabilities. It was straightforward work. Once we hit the right altitude, we'd release them into orbit and monitor their initial stabilization. Nothing we hadn't done dozens of times before. The first few hours went as expected. The launch was clean, no anomalies. We reached orbit without incident. The Earth a blue and green curve below us. The feeling of weightlessness was familiar now, even comforting. I was busy running diagnostics on the first satellite when the signal came through. At first, I thought it was interference. Space isn't silent like people think. There's always noise in the background. But this wasn't static or a garbled transmission. It was rhythmic, almost musical in a way. The tone repeated, a pattern, and it caught our attention immediately. Captain Reeves was the first to react. He ordered us to triangulate the source while he reported the anomaly back to ground control. The signal wasn't coming from Earth or any known satellite. It was faint but persistent, originating from somewhere just beyond our planned trajectory. Reeves decided to investigate. The shuttle had enough fuel for minor course adjustments, and the mission clock had room to spare. Ground control was hesitant, but didn't object. They wanted answers as much as we did. We adjusted course and followed the signal. As we drew closer, the source became clearer. It was an object, roughly the size of a small aircraft, tumbling slowly through the blackness. It wasn't one of ours, that was obvious. Its surface was dark, almost organic looking, with no visible seams or panels. We got as close as we dared. The object wasn't emitting any heat or showing up on radar. It was just there, hanging in orbit like a dead thing. But the signal was definitely coming from it, pulsing steadily. Reeves decided we needed a closer look. The shuttle wasn't equipped for docking, so we prepared for an EVA. I volunteered to go, along with Martinez, our payload specialist. We suited up, triple-checked everything, and stepped into the airlock. Floating toward the object was surreal. The closer we got, the more alien it looked. Its surface wasn't smooth, but covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift under the light. Martinez reached out to touch it, and that's when everything changed. The object reacted. It lit up, not with lights, but with energy. The patterns on its surface began to move, glowing faintly. A low hum filled the void, vibrating through our suits. The signal we'd been following grew louder, almost deafening. Before we could retreat, the shuttle systems went haywire. The lights inside flickered, and the engines powered down. Over comms, I could hear the panic in Reeves's voice as he tried to regain control. Martinez and I scrambled to get back, but the object had other plans. A beam of light, if you could call it light, reached out from the object, connecting with the shuttle. It wasn't solid, more like a stream of particles, but it had force. The shuttle was caught in its grip, pulled slowly toward the object. Reeves shouted for us to get inside, but the airlock wouldn't open. The shuttle's systems were completely unresponsive. We clung to the hull, helpless as the object began to pull all of us closer. Inside the shuttle, the lights returned briefly. A strange pattern danced across the walls, like shadows moving where there was no source. I heard a voice, not over the comms, not in my ears, but in my head. It wasn't speaking words, but I understood it. It was asking for help. The realization hit me hard. The object wasn't a weapon or a trap. It was a vessel, damaged and stranded. It had been caught in Earth's gravity, unable to escape. The signal we'd followed was a distress call, but now it was feeding off our systems to sustain itself. Martinez and I managed to force the airlock open manually and get inside. Reeves looked pale, gripping the controls like he could will them back to life. The shuttle was being drained, its power redirected to the object. I don't know what came over me, but I spoke to it, out loud, not knowing if it could hear me. I told it we couldn't survive without power, that we would help if it let us go. The hum softened, almost like it was listening. The shuttle jolted and the beam disconnected. The object drifted away, its glow dimming. Our systems rebooted one by one and the engines roared back to life. Reeves didn't wait for ground control's approval. He fired the thrusters and got us out of there as fast as possible. Back on Earth, we were debriefed for hours. The official report called it an encounter with unknown space debris, but we knew better. The object wasn't debris, it was alive in its own way, and it had been desperate. I still think about that voice, the way it felt in my head. Whatever it was, it didn't mean us harm. It just wanted to survive, and for a moment, we were the only ones who could help it. I was flying a routine test mission that day, nothing I hadn't done before. The jet I was piloting was a new stealth model, cutting-edge stuff, the kind of plane they keep in underground hangars and only bring out when they're sure no one's watching. I'd been training in it for months, so I knew its capabilities inside and out, or at least I thought I did. We were up at 40,000 feet, somewhere over the Nevada desert. The skies were clear, visibility perfect. I'd done a dozen runs like this before, testing the jet's evasive maneuvers, pushing its limits. It was supposed to be uneventful, just data gathering for the engineers back on the ground. That changed when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow, maybe a trick of the light. Trick of the light. But shadows don't hover. It was off my left wing, just a dark shape, smooth and featureless. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a car, but it didn't look like any drone or plane I'd ever seen. There were no lights, no markings, nothing. I called it in. Control, this is Alpha 2. I've got a visual on an unidentified object, bearing 270, 500 yards. There was a pause before the reply. Alpha 2, say again? It's a bogey control. It's matching my altitude and speed. No response to signals. Copy that, Alpha 2. Maintain visual and stand by for instructions. I kept my eyes on it, expecting it to veer off or accelerate, but it didn't. It just hovered there, almost casual, like it was studying me. That's when my radar went haywire. The display lit up with alerts, but none of it made sense. The system couldn't lock onto the thing. It wasn't there, according to the instruments. Then it moved. It was fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen. 1 second it was off my wing, and the next it was directly in front of me, blocking my flight path. I pulled up hard, banking left, trying to avoid a collision. My stomach lurched as the G-forces kicked in, but the thing was still there, perfectly aligned with my nose. I rolled right, diving to lose it. The jet systems screamed warnings at me, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from it. But no matter what I did, it stayed right in front of me, mirroring my every move. It wasn't following me, it was predicting me. Every turn, every roll, every dive, it was already there, waiting. It didn't just react. It anticipated. I felt like a mouse in a trap, every escape route blocked before I could take it. Control, I've got no evasion options, I shouted. This thing's on me like glue. Alpha 2, disengage and return to base. Disengage how? I snapped. It knows what I'm doing before I do. I could hear the panic in my own voice. Pilots don't panic. We're trained not to. But this was different, human. I started improvising, throwing the jet into moves that didn't make sense. Zigzag patterns, random flips, anything to break its rhythm. The jet groaned under the strain, the frame pushed to its limits. Sweat dripped down my face, and my hands ached from gripping the controls so tightly. It worked. For a split second, I lost it. The shadow vanished from my view. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. A second later, it reappeared above me, perfectly aligned as if mocking my efforts. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a chase. It could have taken me down at any moment if it wanted to. It was testing me, just like I'd been testing the jet. I was the subject of an experiment, and I didn't like where it was heading. I tried to call control again, but my comms were dead. Every system was. No radar, no navigation, not even basic altitude readings. The cockpit lights flickered, and the engine whined like it was under some kind of strain I couldn't identify. The object pulsed then, a ripple of light running across its surface. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It shimmered, almost translucent, like it was made of liquid glass. I felt a pressure in my head, like a low hum that wasn't a sound, but something deeper. It made my teeth ache. I don't know what came over me, but I started talking to it, out loud. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was instinct, but I spoke. I don't know what you want, I said, but I'm not your enemy. The hum stopped. Just like that, just the pressure in my head vanished, and the object moved again, slower this time. It circled me, almost lazily, before pulling ahead and stopping dead in my path. It hung there for a moment, then shot straight up, disappearing into the sky faster than I could blink. My systems came back online all at once, the sudden flood of lights and sounds almost overwhelming. Control was shouting in my ear, asking for my status, but I didn't answer right away. I was too busy staring at the empty sky where the object had been. I made it back to base somehow. They debriefed me for hours, asking the same questions over and over. What did it look like? How did it move? Did it attack? I told them everything, but I could tell they didn't believe half of it. They chalked it up to equipment failure and pilot error. But I know what I saw. That thing wasn't human. It wasn't from here. And whatever it was smarter than me, faster than me, yet better than anything we've ever put in the sky. I still fly, but I keep one eye on the horizon now. I don't think it's coming back for me, but if it does, I don't know if I'll be lucky enough to outfly it again. And it started during what was supposed to be an easy flight. I was alone, doing a routine patrol over a mostly uninhabited stretch of coastline. The kind of flight you could do blindfolded after a few years. The weather forecast had called for clear skies, but a bank of clouds had rolled in unexpectedly. Big, heavy ones. I didn't think much of it. You fly through worse. I entered the cloud around 10,000 feet. It was thick, so thick it felt like flying through a wall. I couldn't see the wings of my own aircraft. My instruments worked fine, but there was this strange static in my headset, faint but there. I assumed it was interference from the moisture or the plane's electronics. Clouds do that sometimes. About halfway through, the static changed. It wasn't random anymore. It sounded rhythmic, almost like clicking. I remember sitting there, gripping the controls tighter, trying to figure out if it was mechanical or natural. Before I could work it out, I broke through the other side of the cloud. The sun hit me like a spotlight, and everything seemed normal again. I took a breath and glanced over the controls. Everything seemed fine. I checked my wings instinctively, a habit after flying through weather like that. That's when I saw it. It was attached to the right wing, near the tip. At first I thought it was some sort of debris, maybe a loose flap of fabric from a weather balloon or a torn-up piece of plastic. But it wasn't moving like something caught in the wind. It clung to the wing with long, translucent tendrils that wrapped around the edge like fingers. The main body was almost transparent, but there were faint blue and purple veins running through it, pulsing slowly like it was alive. It reminded me of a jellyfish. I tried to shake it off. I dipped the wing, jerked the stick back and forth, even climbed a few thousand feet to see if the change in pressure would do anything. It didn't move. It just held on, its tendrils tightening slightly as if it knew what I was doing. My heart was pounding now. I called back to base. Control, this is Echo 1. I've got something on my wing. Unidentified. It's biological. Requesting instructions. There was static on the line, but I heard enough to know they didn't understand. Repeat, Echo 1. You're breaking up. Say again. I tried to explain again, but the static got worse. It wasn't normal interference. It had that same rhythmic clicking pattern I'd heard in the cloud. I shut off my radio, figuring it was useless for now, and focused on the thing. It started to move. Slowly, but it was definitely moving. The body rippled like it was breathing. The tendrils unwrapped slightly, reaching out along the wing. I thought about climbing higher, hoping the cold would kill it. But the idea of going any further up with this thing on my plane didn't sit right with me. I started a slow descent, hoping to get back to base as quickly as possible. That's when my instruments went haywire. The altimeter spun wildly, the compass needle jerked back and forth, and the speed gauge flatlined. I lost all sense of where I was. Even my backup systems were useless. The static in my headset got louder, drowning out everything else. It wasn't just clicks anymore. There was something deeper in the sound, like a low hum or a growl. Then I saw it. A light far off in the distance, just barely visible against the bright sky. It was pulsing, the same rhythm as the thing's veins. At first, I thought it was another aircraft, but it didn't move like one. It was too steady, too deliberate. It was coming toward me. The thing on my wing pulsed faster, its tendrils stretching out even further. They glowed faintly now, the same blue and purple as the veins in its body. It wasn't just a parasite, it was a beacon. The light in the distance grew brighter, closer. I could make out its shape now, a massive oval craft, black and smooth like obsidian. It moved silently, defying every law of aerodynamics I'd ever learned. I panicked. I slammed the throttle forward, trying to push my plane to its limits. The thing on my wing tightened its grip, almost like it was holding on for dear life. The clicking in my headset turned into a screech, high-pitched and unbearable. I ripped the headset off and threw it to the side. The craft was right behind me now, filling up my rearview mirrors. It didn't fire any weapons or make any threatening moves. It just followed, matching my every maneuver with ease. It was toying with me or studying me. I knew I couldn't outrun it. My only chance was to deal with the thing on my wing. I remembered the emergency flares. They weren't much, but they burned hot. I popped the canopy slightly, just enough to release a flare. The wind tore at my face, deafening and freezing, but I managed to angle the flare launcher toward the wing. I fired. The flare shot out, a bright, angry streak of red. It hit the edge of the wing, right near the thing's body. The reaction was immediate. The jellyfish-like creature let out a flash of blinding light, its veins flaring white-hot. It released its grip on the wing, the tendrils retracting quickly. It drifted off into the air, hovering for a moment before falling away. The pulsing stopped, and so did the clicking in my headset. My instruments snapped back to life, the dials stabilizing as if nothing had happened. The craft behind me slowed, then stopped. It hovered for a moment, as if deciding what to do. Then it turned, disappearing into the horizon in a blink. I didn't stick around to see if it would come back. I dove straight for the base, radioing in as soon as I was close enough for the signal to get through. I didn't bother trying to explain the whole story over the air. When I landed, the mechanics found scorch marks on the wing where the thing had been. No other damage, no sign of the creature. I still don't know what it was or why it was there, but I know it wasn't random. It was waiting for something or someone, and whatever it was signaling to, it's still out there. We were flying a standard cargo route, nothing unusual. Just another night in the air, hauling equipment to the base. There were 3 of us on board. Me, the pilot, Anders, the co-pilot, and Davis, the loadmaster. The hold was packed tight with crates, mostly spare parts and some sealed containers we didn't ask too much about. Military jobs usually came with the unspoken rule of not prying. The flight had been smooth, a straight shot over the ocean. Weather was clear, instruments were good, and we'd been cruising at altitude for hours. It was quiet except for the hum of the engines. Anders had just started a story about his old training days when Davis called over the intercom from the back. "You guys hear that?" he said. "Hear what?" I asked. "Thought I heard something moving back here," he said. "Probably nothing. Could be the pressure messing with me." "Double check the straps," Anders said. "Last thing we need is a loose crate sliding around." We didn't think much of it, but a few minutes later, Davis called again, this time sounding less casual. "I'm telling you, there's something moving back here. I'm checking it out." I glanced at Anders. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. It wasn't unheard of for stuff to shift during flights, but Davis wasn't the jumpy type. We waited for him to check in, but 5 minutes went by, then 10. Nothing. "Davis, you good back there?" I asked over the intercom. No response. I put the plane on autopilot and motioned for Anders to stay put. "Keep an eye on things up here. I'll see what's going on." The cargo hold was dimly lit, the overhead lights giving off a cold, pale glow. The air felt different back there, heavier, like the space was pressing down on me. I moved slowly between the rows of crates, calling Davis's name. No answer. About halfway down the hold, I saw his flashlight lying on the floor. The beam was still on, pointing at nothing. My chest tightened. I bent to pick it up, and that's when I heard it. A faint, wet sound, like something sticky being peeled off a surface. It came from behind one of the larger containers, the kind that's bolted down. I shone the flashlight toward the noise, and for a second I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Something moved, quick and fluid, like a shadow but solid. It slipped out of the light before I could focus on it. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to move closer. I turned the corner, and that's when I saw Davis. He was on the floor, slumped against the container. His eyes were open, but he wasn't looking at me. He was staring past me, his face pale and frozen in an expression I can only describe as terror. I dropped to my knees and shook him, but he didn't respond. He wasn't dead. He was breathing, shallow and fast, but it was like he was locked inside himself. Then I heard it again, the wet, peeling noise. It was closer now, almost behind me. I turned, shining the flashlight wildly, and there it was. It was crouched low, half hidden in the shadows. Its body was slick and dark, almost like oil, and it shimmered faintly in the light. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a dog, but its shape was wrong, all sharp angles and smooth curves that didn't make sense together. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were two glowing slits, bright and unblinking. It didn't move right away. It just stared at me, like it was waiting to see what I'd do. I couldn't look away. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my brain screaming at me to run, but my body refusing to listen. Then it made a sound, a low, vibrating hum that I felt in my chest more than I heard. The lights flickered, and I realized the hum wasn't just noise. It was doing something, affecting the plane somehow. I don't know how I found the strength, but I managed to stand and back away slowly, keeping the flashlight on it. It didn't follow me. It just stayed there, watching. When I got to the intercom, I grabbed it and shouted, "Anders, get back here now!" He didn't argue. A minute later, he appeared at the edge of the hold, his face going pale when he saw Davis and the thing. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said, "but it's not from here." We didn't have time to figure out what to do. The hum got louder, and the plane started to shudder. Alarms went off in the cockpit. Something was messing with the electronics. Anders ran back to try and stabilize us, leaving me alone with it. It started to move then, slowly unfolding itself like it had been cramped up for too long. Its body shifted and stretched, almost like it was trying to decide what shape to take. It didn't come toward me, though. It turned its attention to one of the sealed containers. It approached it cautiously, its tendrils or arms or whatever they were, reaching out and brushing the surface. That's when I understood. It wasn't just hiding in the cargo hold. It was running from something, and whatever it was looking for was inside that container. The plane jolted violently, knocking me off my feet. The thing froze, its glowing slits narrowing. I scrambled back, shouting for Anders, but he didn't answer. The alarms were louder now, the plane struggling to stay in the air. The creature turned back to me, and for a moment I thought it was going to attack, but instead it backed away, retreating into the shadows. The hum stopped and the plane steadied. Anders finally managed to regain control, and we made an emergency landing at the nearest base. When the crew came to inspect the cargo hold, the creature was gone. Davis was alive but unresponsive, and the sealed container had been opened. Whatever had been inside was missing. The military took over from there. They didn't tell us much, just that we weren't to speak of it. Davis recovered eventually, but he never talked about what he saw. I still don't know what that thing was or what it wanted, but I know this much. It wasn't here by accident. It was running from something, and whatever it was running from, it's still out there.